What you're about to hear is part 5 in a series that I've been working on over the past year on the First and Second Indochina Wars, the French War, and then the American War. If you haven't checked out the previous parts, go check them out. It's going to be really weird if you listen to part 5, not having listened to 1 through 4, but I know some of you like your stories out of order, and you'll just jump in and have a blast with it. And if that's you, I hope you enjoy. I'd be remiss if I did not ask you to subscribe to the podcast wherever you're listening, rate, review the show. Those things help a ton with these podcast algorithms. I don't fully know how these algorithms work, I'll be totally honest with you, but I do know that ratings and reviews help a ton. If you want to support the show a bit more than that, if you want to contribute monetarily, you can support the show on Patreon. Also, if you're a member of the Patreon, you'll get an extra episode of Hell in a Small Place, about 26 minutes of extra content that nobody else will get. It won't go out in podcast feeds or anything like that. It's only on Patreon. So if you want to get that and you want to support the show and help me out a little bit, you can do that on Patreon. And also I've got the Substack newsletter where I'm releasing content once a week on there. So it's announcements about new shows and some other stuff as well. We have a great time over there. So links for all those things will be in the show notes below. Without any further ado and any more announcements, let's get into the final part in Hell in a Small Place, Hell in a Small Place Part 5.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
There can be no peace in the world until the military power of Japan is destroyed.
We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time.
Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
I feel like this series has been a study in human psychology, in American psychology. Human beings have a propensity to, have patterns or rhythms. And Americans are very much that same way. Americans have rhythms. And if you go back in history and you look at American history, you will find things that just tend to be rhythmic. It rhymes. Nothing quite seems to realize this as the way the American people vote, the way the American people pick winners and losers, or at least what they think will be a winner versus a loser. And what are those qualities that they think are in a winner versus the qualities that they think are in a loser? It doesn't necessarily mean that they're correct, but these are the salesperson's qualities. If the salesperson, in this case, I'm using a salesperson as a representative of a political candidate, but as a political candidate is trying to sell themselves to the American people, here are the qualities, the things that Americans tend to be excited about. They tend to back, they tend to desire. And I bring that up because it's so interesting to consider what Americans perceive as the winning horse. Like, what are the aspects of a winning horse that the Americans as a whole are attracted to? If you are looking at all the different aspects, speed, strength, what are the different, variables, the different things that Americans look at in their political leaders that for them convince them, that horse is going to run. That horse is going to win. We can go and, be successful with this horse. For my money, it seems like strength, or the perception of strength in a person, is what Americans are attracted to. And maybe I'm thinking of 2016 too much when I say this, but it seems like there's something almost at a grassroots level that happens with Americans when you feel like a candidate or a group of candidates or a party seem to have strength that the other ones don't have. What do I mean by strength? I mean, there's like a bellicose nature to this candidate or candidates. There's a devil-may-care kind of a quality. Something is just innately attractive, I feel like, for the regular American looking at their political leaders. They want somebody who's the hammer, and then, their party is the anvil, and they want to smash their enemies between the hammer and the anvil. I don't know if that is necessarily true or if that can be proven out. It's a gut feeling. It seems to me Americans hate losers. They love winners, hate losers. It's sort of like a job interview with these presidential elections. You can get a sense for how the job is going to go from the interview, but you don't have a clue and you can't trial run it. So you can't do it for a week and then say, nope, that's not going to work. Let's go get another one. Same thing with political candidates. You kind of have to fire a shot in the dark based on a first impression, and that first impression might not be very accurate to what the candidate is going to end up being as a president. In the case of Richard Nixon and his future Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, they run for president in the wake of Lyndon Johnson's abdication. They run on this platform that's going to end the war. What they said in their campaign was, we will end the war and win the peace. And you would think that that's a soft approach, right? Their whole campaign is bent upon winning peace, leaving Vietnam. But at this point, by 1968, after the Tet Offensive, opinion for the war has eroded so much that all Americans want is to leave. They don't want to be there anymore. They don't want to be embarrassed anymore. They're tired of the bad press. They're tired of a war in, thousands of miles away where their boys are dying, and it seems like we're not getting any, real effect out of the effort. I try to think, too, about the many different downstream effects of Lyndon Johnson's 1968 abdication and what that means. That is unprecedented. And I think it's very difficult to find a one-for-one comparison because it doesn't happen. President Biden did a very similar thing, but it was expected. He's infirm. There's the questions about his health. Everybody's kind of just waiting for him to step aside so Kamala Harris can run in his place. And, it's not all that shocking. It's shocking because how often does this sort of thing happen? But it's not shocking in the sense that, that's probably what needed to happen. Probably needed to clear the way for a more mentally firm candidate to run in his place. Well, in Lyndon Johnson's case, he's mentally firm. All his faculties are there. When he's abdicating, it's not a let's clear the way for somebody else to come and fix the problems. It's a I have failed. My presidency has been a failure. I'm going to admit it on national TV because it's what's in the best interest for the American people. That is wildly unprecedented. And the downstream effects and the long-lasting effects of that speech to me are many. It's also hard to know exactly what the effects are because there's a general shock and an awe. And, I try to imagine what it would have been like to be a young American at that time. Imagine if you're like in college, you're starting to gather, your feelings about things. You're starting to narrow down what do I believe? Then you hear the president abdicate his presidency, admit it was all a failure on national TV. What does that do? And then even further, the follow-up candidate, of course, is a hawk like Nixon, who's notorious on Capitol Hill for his hawkish tendencies. He is a waspish character and somebody who has always favored strength as the way forward. And then he runs with Kissinger. And they run on, we're going to fix the problem. We're going to win the peace. We're going to make everybody happy. We're going to get our POWs back, and we're going to set up South Vietnam as a democracy. It seems a bit like the pie in the sky, everything's rosy. We're going to put rose-tinted glasses on this situation, and yet everybody believes them. Because again, there is this, pervading idea amongst Americans that they are naturally superior. And if you believe you're naturally superior, it's like, despite all the evidence to the contrary, we can still get what we want out of this situation. Probably the question, though, that dominates Americans' minds, maybe even Richard Nixon and Kissinger's minds, the question of what do we want from this situation? Americans believe they can get it, but what do they want? I think if you'd ask Nixon, you might get one answer. If you'd ask Kissinger, you might get a slightly altered version of that same answer. And if you ask the American people, you'd get a very different answer from the two of them. If anybody had asked Barbara Tuchman at the time, her answer might have looked something like what she said in her book, The March of Folly. She writes, quote, "The logical course was to cut losses, forego assurance of a viable non-communist South Vietnam, and leave without negotiating with the enemy except for a one-condition agreement buying back American prisoners of war in exchange for a pledged time limit on American withdrawal." End quote. Here's the thing, though. That negotiation tack is not going to sit well with Henry Kissinger. Kissinger is a power politics devotee. What do I mean by that? I mean, he is always trying to operate from a position of strength, always trying to project strength. The notion that the United States would not negotiate with the enemy, except for some sort of an agreement about how you could get prisoners of war out of there, that's not going to fly, because that does not project strength. That projects we've lost and we're just trying to leave. The heart of what Barbara Tuchman is saying there is that to continue in any form or fashion would have been folly. She's writing, somewhat as an armchair historian, but, she's got the credentials. She can say stuff like this. She's writing after the fact in the 80s saying, after 1968, after the Tet Offensive, after Lyndon B. Johnson has abdicated, now's the time just to cut your losses and go home. Kissinger and Nixon are of a different mind. And it's also hard to kind of judge people after the fact because, it's difficult to factor in all the emotions and all the things that they're feeling. But at the same time, you look at how Nixon handled things and his emotional responses to things, and you realize he takes a personal affront almost to everything that the Vietnamese do. If they attack, Nixon thinks, oh, they're attacking my ego somehow. His ego and the war in Vietnam are conflated. Kissinger probably, to a certain extent, is the same way. They look at Vietnam as a proving ground for their, partisan platform, but also as a proving ground for their egos. And I don't know a ton of things about politics, but I can tell you that anytime a politician gets their ego mixed up in foreign policy, things can get a little dicey. In late 1968, early 1969, the Rand Corporation offered up suggestions for what U.S. policy should be. And funnily enough, it looks very similar to what Barbara Tuchman said in The March of Folly. Essentially, they're saying, wash your hands of the situation, leave, but, get POWs back, but don't seek assurances about what the South Vietnamese government's going to look like when North Vietnam eventually kind of takes over, which is what everybody feels like is going to happen. And let's also not forget we've got the shot clock, or the thing lurking on the horizon, China, Soviet Union. Everybody still feels handcuffed. You can't just go invade North Vietnam or anything, because then China will get all uppity about it. And that's worst case scenario. So you got to stay put, but the corners are closing in. Rand Corporation says leave, cut your losses, but Henry Kissinger, the power politics devotee, says instead, or at least it's easy to equate what Kissinger's feelings are with the administration because Kissinger sort of runs the foreign policy for Nixon's administration. The administration comes with 4 things that they're going to try and achieve in Vietnam. They're going to end the draft, they're going to bring home combat troops, intensify the air war and extend that air war into Cambodia and Laos, and they're going to begin this process called Vietnamization. What is Vietnamization? The simple of it, I guess, is what Barbara Tuchman says in her book, March of Folly. She writes about Vietnamization, quote, "This effort was perhaps belated in what had always been supposed to be their, with quotes, their war. The theory was that floods of material would somehow accomplish what had not been accomplished over the past 25 years, the creation of a motivated fighting force able to preserve a viable non-communist state." End quote. The solution to all of those crying out at home, the American people saying, "Get us out of here, send our boys home. We have no business fighting a war thousands of miles away." The solution is, okay, we'll send our soldiers home, but we're going to continue bombing North Vietnam, and we're going to extend the bombing into Laos and Cambodia, and we're just going to pour more money and material into the South Vietnamese army. Major General in the South Vietnamese army, Nguyen Huy Hinh, wrote a book where he details from his perspective what happened to the South Vietnamese army, how Vietnamization affected it. He writes, quote, "The years 1969 and 1970 witnessed an unprecedented development of the armed forces of the Republic of Vietnam. Their total strength was rapidly increased from 700,000 in early 1968 to nearly 1 million in late 1970. Major ARVN combat forces consisted of 10 infantry divisions fully equipped with modern weapons." End quote. The other thing to come out of this is Nixon and Kissinger's plan to project near insanity about Richard Nixon to all of their opponents. The opponents being the Soviets, the Chinese, and the Vietnamese. It is literally the mad dog theory. There's a British admiral during World War I where he puts out this idea that was a bit lambasted at the time, but he puts out an idea that basically says, if you act brutally to your enemy, if you kill civilians, if you attack when the enemy least expects it, if you kind of remove yourself from the decorum of fighting wars and conduct yourself, reprehensibly in the eyes of your enemy is going to be scared to provoke you because who knows what you're going to do to him. You might cause severe anguish for him and his country, so he's going to leave you well enough alone. Well, Kissinger and Nixon operate very similarly to how that British admiral would say you should operate when you're fighting wars. They put forward this idea called Operation Duck Hook, which is a blitz bombing campaign of Cambodia, Laos, and North Vietnam, similar in the vein to like the Blitz of Dresden or something in World War II, where Allied forces bomb Germany to rubble. It's a very similar concept to that, but it also includes even a step further. It includes nuclear weapons. We've talked about at times how nuclear weapons are dangled at the end of a hook a little bit here and there. This is in the height of nuclear scares, left, right, and center, from the Soviets to the Chinese to, whoever has them. They're using them as bait. They're using them as a negotiating tactic because everybody's scared about what, it might mean if you add nuclear weapons into the mix. Does it precipitate World War III? I don't really want to mess with that. We're just going to leave that one well enough alone. So Nixon and Kissinger dangle duck hook, and they say, we might drop some nuclear weapons on Cambodia. We might drop a couple nukes on North Vietnam. Don't mess with us. We're the mad dog on the block. And it is funny how effective this negotiating tact is because the North Vietnamese take it hook, line, and sinker. I mean, they believe Nixon is crazy. What do you do with a crazy world leader? You leave him alone. You don't provoke him. As an aside, the Russians think this is perfectly natural. The Russians think he's a little crazy, but they just think he's a rational politician, which I find hilarious. Duck Hook is ultimately tabled. probably for many good reasons. It's one of those ideas that probably never had legs in the first place, but you throw it out there just in case the enemy thinks that you're capable of doing it. The primary objective from this point on is Vietnamization. The Communist Party in North Vietnam met in 1970, and at this discussion that they have together, they are trying to figure out what Nixon and Kissinger are going to do, what their strategy is going to be. They come up with 4 points. They believe that Nixon first will protect Vietnamization through gradual de-escalation. They believe that second, he's going to threaten the revolution, meaning their efforts, the Viet Cong efforts, in the countryside through pacification. They believe third, Nixon will strengthen Saigon through military activity in Cambodia and Laos. And fourth, Kissinger's not really going to be negotiating for peace, but that he will meet to negotiate and he will cooperate, but he's only doing it to pacify U.S. public opinion. By early 1970, U.S. public opinion is in a tenuous spot. Richard Nixon and Kissinger came into office saying they would end the war, win the peace, right? They are confident, they're bellicose. And yet, it seems like these things that they promised aren't really happening. Then in April 1970, U.S. and South Vietnamese forces go 18 miles into Cambodia. It's initially meant to be a secret operation. You don't want it to get out in public that, oh yeah, we're going on the offensive again. After we said that we weren't going to, but we're going on the offensive again. You might wonder, what do you gain from going on the offensive? If you're trying to strengthen the Saigon regime, what you're going to do is you're going to spread your enemy out. U.S. and South Vietnamese decision makers knew that Cos Vinh, that Viet Cong headquarters, they had a headquarters in Cambodia. But also, too, if we zoom out a little bit wider, there's more going on than just North Vietnamese VC communists and cadres operating in Cambodia. There's some political elements to this, too. Cambodia has a prince named Sihanouk who has been negotiating a bit with the Chinese, with North Vietnamese. He is an erratic little fellow. There's a radio broadcast at one point where he's screaming abuse at somebody on the radio broadcast in a falsetto, and a Westerner described him as, quote, he sounded less like a head of state making a diplomatic detente than a schoolgirl hockey player accusing another of sticks, end quote. Sihanouk is popular amongst the locals in Cambodia, and the North Vietnamese and the Chinese want him because he's controllable. For all of his faults, Sihanouk, he's predictable. You know what you're getting. But then one of his generals, Lon Nol, launches a coup, expatriates Sihanouk, and takes over Cambodia with this military junta. Then Lon Nol and his cadres appeal to the Americans for aid. So you're in a tricky situation now if you're America, because the president and Kissinger, his Secretary of State, they've come in saying that we're going to end the war, we're not going to expand it. That means no more offensive strategies, but you also kind of have to balance the power politics part of this, where Barbara Tuchman says, just leave, don't worry about all the different contingencies, don't worry about, playing the power politics like Kissinger is so wont to do. Don't worry about any of that. Kissinger is the opposite side of that coin. You got to maintain a negotiating position of strength the entire time. And when Lon Nol takes over Cambodia, it seems obvious that if you're eventually going to try and, spread the communists out into Cambodia and Laos, well, it would only follow that you're going to support Lon Nol, which the United States does. As Max Hastings puts it, quote, Washington responded with sufficient arms and cash to sustain Lon Nol's regime for the next 5 years, but not nearly enough to crush the indigenous communist Khmer Rouge, which almost overnight became a serious military force. End quote. Lon Nol's pathetic little army is overwhelmed. The Khmer Rouge pop up almost out of nowhere, And from the start, they are a problem for everyone. The Khmer Rouge hate the Vietnamese. They hate the Americans. There is a little bit of a cultural kind of disdain between the Vietnamese and the Cambodians. The Vietnamese look down on the Cambodians. They see them as, a backwater version of what the Vietnamese are, which is really funny. You find this all throughout history. Neighboring cultures kind of look askance at one another. One always feels like he's superior to the other. In this case, it's the Vietnamese. They're like, we've been struggling for years doing what, the Khmer Rouge say they're going to do. We've been fighting for the communist revolution for 30 years now. Khmer Rouge are just upstarts, right? It's one of those things, though, where I think for everybody involved, it gets a little out of hand before they even know what's hit them. Khmer Rouge are led by a guy named Pol Pot. And if you are looking on the scale of authoritarian dictators and you're trying to rate them on a scale of 1 to 10 on the evil scale, Pol Pot's going to be near 10. A lot of times when you're looking back on history, you look at things with a clear 20/20 view of it, right? Hitler, Stalin, Mao, they all get lumped in together as like the most evil dictators ever, right? Because they have a body count associated with them. You can look at Mao and say, yeah, he probably killed in the neighborhood of, 3 to 6 million of his own people. Hitler obviously presided over the Holocaust. There's millions of bodies there. Stalin, same kind of deal, presided over the extermination of millions of his own people. Pol Pot is right there with him. The Khmer Rouge kill almost indiscriminately their own people, Vietnamese. And it is a cruel, sort of merciless style of killing that is just so strange to find, because it seems like it has almost no reason, or it's so indiscriminate that it is special in its own scale, and if you're rating it on the evil scale. You almost put it separately, like the Holocaust is terrible, merciless, senseless, and we understand the reasons behind it because we have debated this now for 80 years. We understand how evil it is, and we understand how terrible it was. Khmer Rouge flies under the radar, but it is no less terrible. Pol Pot is supposed to have said that he wanted to remake the world, and in order to remake the world, he's going to destroy all the constructs of the world, which means he's going to remove all institutions from Cambodian life. He's going to dissolve marriages and families. He's going to dissolve the government and all of its constructs. The Khmer Rouge institutes a new calendar at one point. They have new state holidays. They wipe away all of the old world and replace it with what Pol Pot wants the new world to be. They round up Cambodians and send them to death camps. They round up Vietnamese soldiers that they find, send them to death camps. And it's not like the Khmer Rouge just show up and, shoot everyone and then leave. No, they come in, they grab everyone, and they start butchering them wholesale. The sad part about the Khmer Rouge is, yes, what they do, but the fact that nobody knew what was happening as it was happening. Nobody was prepared for it. The Vietnamese were surprised by it. The U.S. was surprised by it. And yet they both hold responsibility for what happens next, which, in the grand scheme of things, is 2 to 4 million innocent people are killed. The natural byproduct of this expanding of the war is further unrest at home. Henry Kissinger wanted a stronger footing to stand on so that he could negotiate with Le Duc Tho and the North Vietnamese government. But what you create in this situation where you expand the fighting is, it is now obvious to everyone at home, and this is being reported everywhere, right? This is like in the New York Times kind of a thing. The regular Joe, the welder that works his, 9 to 5, he is getting a look under the hood, if you will, about what's happening in Southeast Asia. And the regular person who's not going to know all the context, they are going to know this for a fact, They're going to know what Nixon and Kissinger ran on, which is now 2 years old at this point. In 1968, or I guess 1967, they're doing all this campaigning. And then 68, after Johnson abdicates, Nixon and Kissinger are elected, and they're running on, we're going to win the war, or end the war, win the peace, right? Well, the war's very much not over. There's no peace, and you could argue the war has intensified. From Max Hastings' book, Vietnam, he catalogs a MACV briefer who runs down the list of all the different conflicts going on in Southeast Asia and how they're all related. He writes, quote, "A MACV briefer cataloged the 7 interrelated but separate conflicts across the region. Civil war in northern Laos, the NVA's struggle to sustain its logistics links in southern Laos and Cambodia, the Cambodian Civil War, the Cosvin Border Theater in South Vietnam, the battle in the Delta, the Central War Zone, and the Northern one." End quote. Makes you wonder, where's the line? Where's the point at which you cross the Rubicon, as it were, and you've entered a whole new world and the people have had enough? What is that point? What is the demarcation line? We haven't really talked about this a ton, but it is a ubiquitous thing happening all throughout this conflict. After maybe 1966, you have protests. You don't only have protests, you have like massive demonstrations. Lyndon Johnson has to deal with this while he's president. It's probably a good part of the reason why he ends up not running again, because the public opinion is so obviously against him, and it's a loud group of people. It's people that don't want to be drafted. It's protests for all sorts of reasons, but the 2 main reasons are end the war, get us out of there. We're not accomplishing anything. It's that lack of cause and effect part of the equation. It's also the draft part of the equation. People don't want to be forced to go to Vietnam. They dovetail together because you don't want to be forced to go fight in a war you don't believe in. So Nixon, Kissinger, when they get elected, they think that if we end the draft, that will, nip some of this protesting in the bud. Well, when it doesn't nip the protesting in the bud because the war expands, you wonder if they have a moment where they think, oh no, we did the wrong thing. On May 4th, 1970, protesters at Kent State University are fired upon by the National Guard. And this is one of those situations that you don't see stuff like this virtually ever now. And I think it's so symbolic of the moment in time it's happening, because it's very hard to think of a time when you've had a mob and this many soldiers, National Guardsmen there to respond to it. There's about 1,000 National Guardsmen on Kent State's campus by the time that the shooting happens, and there's somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,500 to 2,000 demonstrators on Kent State's campus. Before shots are fired, the governor comes to the campus and basically is trying to talk down the crowd. The governor's saying, go home, but it doesn't work. Eventually, the National Guardsmen go to disperse the crowd with tear gas, with bayonets. And here's the other thing, too. The National Guardsmen are wearing, full military kit. If you didn't know, if you're looking at black and white images and you didn't have the landmarks to tell you that this is in the United States, that this is on a college campus, you would think these are photos of the Vietnam War. Troops look pretty much the exact same. They have M1 rifles. They fire on the protesters. 4 protesters are killed. They're all 19, 20-year-olds. There's a famous photo of someone kneeling over a body and it's just laying face down on a concrete sidewalk. Blood everywhere. It becomes a remember the Alamo moment for protests. Nixon expands the war, and the pushback from American people is vehement. Richard Nixon is heavily affected by the Kent State shooting, and apparently A few days later, he goes out to the Lincoln Memorial where he wants to speak to student protesters there. It's a very bizarre moment. I mean, how often do you think you've seen a president go speak with just like a bodyguard, go speak with protesters? First of all, this could never happen now because of like Secret Service and, the people that would surround a president. You're never going to have a world leader, maybe the world leader, going to speak with random protesters. But around 4 a.m, he couldn't sleep because of the Kent State shooting. He goes to the Lincoln Memorial and he starts speaking with protesters. And it's just this very bizarre kind of situation where they speak for maybe an hour and he's trying to explain to the protesters his side of it. And then the protesters are trying to explain to him their side of it. And in a very odd sort of situation, he asks them where they go to school and they say Syracuse. And he says, oh, cool, they got a great football team up there. And the protesters are like, what the hell? What does it matter about Syracuse's football team? It's odd. His chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman, would write about it, quote, I'm concerned about his condition. He's had very little sleep for a long time, and his judgment, temper, and mood suffer badly as a result. End quote. Nixon gets a bad rap all around. Some of it is due to the Nixon-Kissinger combination, the guilt by association, because he's associated with Kissinger, who some people truly think is probably the Antichrist. But he also, brings it on himself, and they approach this presidency with this kind of like mad dog plan where they say, yeah, we're going to make people think I'm insane, that I'm crazy, that I'll do anything. And since they believe that, they're going to be afraid of me. Well, it has consequences too. It might have power politics benefits if your enemies are a little bit scared of what you might do next, but it also has consequences at home because you're going to do things that will have real consequences in real life. And those consequences are not going to just pass you by. You're going to have to suffer through those too. And I got to remind myself that Nixon is a human. Despite all the things that he does, all the blowback that he's going to have to deal with, he's a man. He's immortal. It's something that you try and find in these stories as much as you can, the human element, the part where real people suffer with real people problems. But at the same time, it's weird. You don't want your president going to negotiate, I guess, with student protesters and then just start talking about the Syracuse football team. I mean, let's be honest. Syracuse ain't that great of a football team. I mean, Richard Nixon, we need to have a conversation maybe about our conversation topics. Anyways, the Lincoln Memorial incident, it's a very weird incident. It's kind of representative of Nixon's headspace at that moment in time. Whereas Kissinger's kind of like the iron bulwark against communism, whatever you want to say. Something else I noticed and I thought was worth a minor little discussion here, a digression, if you will. It's the lack of understanding, I guess, maybe. We talk about a lot, and this has been brought up several times throughout this show, this series of shows, that nobody fully understood Vietnam. I've tried to illustrate what that actually means a little bit, but it's difficult to illustrate exactly what that means, because it doesn't mean on its face value, you don't understand Vietnam. It's you don't understand the nuance. You don't understand the context. That is really what it means when people are saying they don't understand Vietnam. They don't know what they've signed up for. The French didn't know what they signed up for. The United States didn't realize what they signed up for. They don't understand the culture, the context. Nobody speaks Vietnamese, this kind of a thing. Like if you really wanted to understand it, you would have had somebody high up in your staff that actually spoke Vietnamese so that maybe you could understand some of the culture and context. Nobody understood the cultural elements of Vietnamese peasants, how you can't just move them away from their homes, like with the Agroville program. You can't just take them away from their farms because they worship their long dead ancestors. So like taking them away from their home is one of the worst possible things you can do. It's stupid if you understand the situation, but nobody does. one of the, maybe it's like a little anecdote that describes this a little bit, but between 1969 or mid to late 1969, there's an increased amount of communist activity and more attacks. It's like small scale Tet offensive attacks kind of a thing. Obviously, they don't have, North Vietnam hasn't rejuvenated, Hanoi hasn't rejuvenated their ability to do this go for broke attack again. They still need to gather their strength back, catch their breath a little bit. But the attacks are continuing. Nixon takes it personal. And so what he does is he sends an angry letter or cable, whatever you want to call it, to Ho Chi Minh. He sends an angry cable to Ho Chi Minh, the ailing leader, and he's basically like, quit. But the part that blows my mind, I can't wrap my mind around this lack of understanding of the situation. He thinks in 1969, Ho Chi Minh is calling the shots, where, as we've seen, Ho Chi Minh hasn't really been calling the shots for like 3 years, maybe even longer. He's been out of fashion and he's been in poor health. He's been an advisor, one of many, but Le Duan has been calling the shots. And I just find it difficult to understand how nobody understood who's in charge. A basic question, I might wonder. Who's running the show? Oh, Ho Chi Minh. Nope, wrong. It's Le Duan. Like, who the Soviet premier is. Mao is running things in China. I feel like you should probably also know who's running things in Vietnam, even though they kind of keep it under wraps. Le Duan doesn't necessarily come out in public and say, I am the Mao of Vietnam. Like, he doesn't expose himself as being the leader in that sense. But I would think that through intelligence and, CIA work or something, you would know, hey, Le Duan, he's the guy. So that when you have a problem, you would talk to him. But no, Nixon thinks that Ho Chi Minh is calling the shots, therefore he directs his ire at Ho Chi Minh, who is dead by late 1969. Very weird situation. And I wonder, if this were to happen in 2024, 2025, would the same kind of thing occur? Would it be possible for a world power to go to war with somebody and not even necessarily know who you're fighting? It's just odd, bizarre. And it's one of those anecdotes that kind of encapsulates the lack of understanding of the nuance and the context and the culture kind of all at one go. And Nixon, again, I've said it before, I'll say it again, Nixon gets a bad rap. But he gets a bad rap for situations like this over and over. The Lincoln Memorial moment, the Ho Chi Minh Cable moment, because for the things that maybe he does well, there's this lack of, a fill in the blank sort of a thing that he seems to not be able to do very well. Maybe it is he leans into the mad dog thing because it's just kind of an extension of his personality. And he lacks that deft touch and nuance. Maybe he's just a bull in a china shop, a hammer and anvil kind of guy. And when you need a little bit of grace, a ballerina's touch to it, he doesn't have it. Something else we've considered in passing throughout these conversations is the question of how far are you willing to go? What are you willing to do? The Pentagon Papers said that, at least for the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, Robert McNamara wrote that they wanted to avoid taint from methods used. Well, what is avoid taint? You want to avoid blowback. You want to avoid negative public opinion. That means that if you do things that are questionable on that, if it got out to public opinion, what's public opinion going to say? It's one of those, if it's questionable, don't let it get out. Or try and operate in a way that's maybe a bit more moral. One of those things that makes you question how far does the United States think they're willing to go you get these weird one-offs, maybe not one-offs, maybe it's just symptoms of the whole, but you get these odd kind of isolated things, siloed things. Siloed's probably a better word. Isolated might not be the correct word there, but these siloed operations where we have seen example after example of moments where the United States kind of operate in a way that's less than savory, right? Institutionally, not in a one-off, as I said, isolated, not as an isolated kind of a thing, but it's a symptom of the larger whole. What about Operation Phoenix? Operation Phoenix is a killing operation. It is a CIA program where they would train South Vietnamese troops. They would pay them triple the normal ARVN soldier salary, and they would send them on missions to eliminate North Vietnamese cadres. Now let's take that on its face value. You're in wartime, so high-level NLF or communist members, cadres, they're targets, right? That makes sense. But when you're sending ARVN troops or specialist ARVN troops to go kill people, there's kind of a connotation there that you are just authorizing the murder of countless people. And the numbers in this program are incredible. Operation Phoenix claims to have killed or captured 80,000 North Vietnamese cadres. Again, I ask the question, how far are you willing to go? Are you willing to accept maybe some taint from methods used? Because when it gets out that Operation Phoenix is going on, has been going on for several years, the guy who conceived of it, William Colby, was called in to testify before a Senate hearing. In February 1970, William Colby has to go speak to the Senate. And according to Max Hastings' book, Vietnam, quote, Colby lied and lied when he declared that Phoenix chiefly captured Vietnamese. It was always a killing program, end quote. Max Hastings then continues, it could justly be said that the Viet Cong did worse things. U.S. researcher Gunter Louis claims that Ban An Ninh Security Section, the terror arm of the NLF, killed 36,725 Vietnamese and abducted 58,499, and such figures are credible. But Americans yearned to believe that their own side behaved better. End quote. I fear the result of this series of shows is going to be that you're going to listen to this back and think, how is it possible that this conflict went on as long as it did? It just seems like it was mistake after mistake after mistake. And it is kind of difficult to separate the mistakes from how people felt at the moment in time. I think a lot of people are harboring doubts at this moment. If we are looking at a grand view, at the moment where we are in the story, a lot of people are harboring doubts that the conflict is ever going to end well at all. But at the same time, there are true believers, and it would be a mistake to say this is all a foregone conclusion, that the United States has made so many mistakes that they're going to add up in the end and they're going to lose. But in the moment where all of this is happening, that is not a common opinion. Maybe the common opinion is doubt, but the common opinion is not, oh, this is over, we're going to lose. There is still this pervading feeling that the United States can figure it out. There's also blind trust in the administrations. It started probably with Kennedy, where if you were to poll people, does the president have your best interests at heart? 90% of them would say yes. You go to the Johnson administration, the first half of that administration, you're probably still in that 80 to 90%. Where we are now in the story, that might be more like 65, 70%. What's changing? Well, this feeling for Americans that had been the case for years and years. This entire generation grew up with this feeling. It stemmed from the downstream effects of World War II, that America rallied together so strongly and was so tightly knit that there's no possible way our president would be lying to us, would be acting in a way that the general American public wouldn't approve of. The regular Joe, if you were to interview him, and I've watched some of these interviews, they still exist and you can find them on YouTube. You put a camera in front of somebody and you ask them, like, do you trust the government? What do you think, Nixon's doing? Does he have your best interests at heart? And they're like, yeah, I think the president knows what he's doing. And, I think we're going to stop communism and all this stuff. It's the talking points. But that's changing, especially after the Kent State shootings. When it is bared, naked for everybody to see the effects of Nixon's war, as it somewhat starts to be called by a few people. The doubt is spreading, but it is not to say that it's all a foregone conclusion. And I think it must be mentioned that while we keep bringing up moments that call all of this into doubt, it's still, it's doubt, but it's not fatalism. Maybe for soldiers on the ground who are being shelled every day and mortared, and this fighting that we've been talking about in previous shows is still continuing. But the war's not over. We still have more to go, and I think there's still blind optimism in some senses that, the Hanoi Politburo is going to fold, that there's going to come a point where they really have had enough. Despite all the previous points where you would think they would say, we've had enough, those points not being enough, I think there are still many people who think there's going to come a point. It's coming, I promise. If we just lean on them a little harder, if we intensify it just a little more, I promise, I swear, there will come a moment when our enemy has had enough. And I think there are a lot of decision makers. Creighton Abrams would tell you this at the time. If you were to hop into a time machine and go to Mac V in Saigon in, mid-1970 and put a microphone in front of Creighton Abrams, he'd probably tell you, gruffly, yeah, I think, if we do X, Y, and Z, or fill in the blank, whatever the action items are, if we do this, this, and this, our enemy will have had enough. Now, keep in mind, everybody who has made some sort of decision throughout this entire process, they have had the correct set of circumstances where they feel like the enemy will have had enough. For Robert McNamara, it's if we bomb all of, North Vietnam's ability to produce things. That didn't really work. Apparently, the war effort didn't stop if you reduced the enemy's ability to create things for the war effort. Okay, that didn't do it. Well, maybe if we just constrict them in the Delta, that didn't work. Okay, well, if we kill a certain amount of them, will run out of human beings. Well, that one hasn't worked either. And so it's difficult to kind of sit on one side or the other to tell the story now, many, many years later, where there is this juggling of multiple different opinions where on the one hand, there's doubt, but it's not fatalist doubt, like there's still a chance it could work, but then there's also kind of this blind optimism. And for a lot of people making decisions and a lot of boots on the ground, you're juggling these two polarities where you doubt, but you also believe, where you believe, but you also doubt. And those opinions sort of shape the feelings about the war, and maybe in different moments, doubt outweighs the belief, and maybe in other moments the belief outweighs the doubt, but it's always there. In late 1969, while everybody is concerned, I guess broadly, with how the war is going to go, how's it going to finish out, Congress does something that they haven't really done this entire process. We have talked a little bit about the congressional approval of going to war a little bit with the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. But What Congress does here is they take power back from the presidency. And this is a little bit of an aside, but it's dovetailing with this entire conversation. There's been a bit of a push and pull throughout history about the office of president and Congress and how much power the presidency has in order to make war or to start wars. Harry Truman famously did not get congressional approval to send troops to Korea. And Lyndon Johnson got the Tonkin Gulf Resolution passed, which, as we've seen in previous shows, by lying to Congress about what actually happened in the Tonkin Gulf. And then he gets the Tonkin Gulf Resolution passed, and this resolution is essentially, if you dumb it down, it's a blank check where Congress hands the office of the president the ability to declare war kind of however he sees fit. It's basically like, if you want to go to war, you can. It's not necessarily saying we're going to war right now, but what Johnson's doing is he's sort of setting a precedent. Well, in late 1969, Congress passes an amendment to the Constitution, the Cooper-Church Amendment, and they passed it by a vote of 78-11, so pretty close to unanimous. This amendment essentially revoked or pulled back these concessions they'd made to the office of the presidency. Now, what these amendments are doing is they prevented, or at least this Cooper-Church Amendment, it prevented U.S. troops from going into Laos and Thailand. Essentially, they can't repeal the stuff that they've already allowed the president to do, but they can prevent it from going any further. And after Nixon's and Kissinger's incursion into Cambodia, Congress is like, you can't keep expanding the war. We've had enough. So they passed a resolution nearly unanimously that says you can't send troops to Laos or Thailand. In June 1970, they finally did repeal the Tonkin Gulf Resolution by a vote of 81-10. So they now revoked that blank check that they'd passed that allows the president to go make war, bypassing Congress essentially whenever he wants. Now, neither one of these two developments are going to limit what's already happening in Vietnam, but they do a couple things. It's a political shot across the bow, I guess, where Congress is saying you can't keep bypassing Congress. You can't allow the president to just kind of go do what he wants. It's one step closer to authoritarianism if you allow the president to operate however he sees fit when it comes to making war. And it's Congress checking the president by saying, we're not going to expand this war any further than you already have. Our old friend Frederick Logval wrote about this Cooper-Church Amendment, quote, "This was really the first time since U.S. involvement in Vietnam began that Congress had found the votes to limit the president's ability to wage war in Southeast Asia." End quote. The Pentagon Papers are published in 1971, in June of 1971, and that's the third nail in the proverbial coffin that's been created with the Cooper-Church Amendment, repealing the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, and now the Pentagon Papers. It would lead to, in 1973, something called the War Powers Resolution, which limited the president's ability to declare war unless it fell into three buckets. Unless there had been a declaration of war against the United States, unless there was specific statutory authorization, or unless there was a national emergency created by an attack upon the United States. That is a whole separate can of worms that probably could be a podcast in and of itself, like what constitutes a president's ability to declare war. But suffice to say, at this moment in time, President Nixon's ability to expand the war has been incredibly hamstrung. And you have to imagine that behind closed doors, he and Kissinger are fuming. Their counter to this check by Congress is that it's put up or shut up time. I feel like it's been put up or shut up time many times throughout this process, but You got to put your chips all on the table and you got to see if the hand of cards you've been dealt will play. They've got to see if Vietnamization is going to work. You can't expand the war. You can't bring in more troops. You can't send your troops into Laos or Thailand. There's really no alternative. If Vietnamization doesn't work, if South Vietnam is not able to stand on its own merits, none of this will work. So they got to figure out if it will work. And then you do the processes of elimination to figure out what is a substantial operation that's not going to endanger the whole thing. What can we do that will, reassure ourselves that South Vietnam is able to handle this without, putting the whole thing in danger? It's difficult to understand how capable South Vietnamese troops are at this time, because I have a feeling, and I'm not a historian, so I would leave that to more educated folks to really nail down whether this is true or not. But I get the sense from the books I've read that American troops feel like, as I think a lot of the memoirs I've read are between 1968 and 1970, they feel like the South Vietnamese troops are terrible. You don't get a whole lot of compliments, let's put it that way. Very few times are you reading memoirs or personal anecdotes where U.S. troops are speaking glowingly of South Vietnamese soldiers. And I think there's probably a lot of different reasons for that. Maybe they're undisciplined, undersupplied, don't have enough food. There's not the martial, army structure with the South Vietnamese military the way there is with the United States military. They're looked down on as an inferior military. There probably is a lot of racism going on here as well. So you read these memoirs from American troops that seem to characterize South Vietnamese troops a certain way. And this is not to say this is like a blanket umbrella that all the troops fault. No, it's very difficult to get into absolutes, but you get the general sense that South Vietnamese troops are less disciplined, less supplied. They are not as put together of a fighting force. But then I go and read General Hien, who wrote the book Lam Son 719, where he details this operation coming up. And the way he writes about his South Vietnamese soldiers, because he is South Vietnamese, it's a bit different. He writes about them as if they're any other military. And so I think there is a little bit of a propaganda on both sides. I think when this book is written by Major General Hien, he's trying to prove to the United States that Vietnamization worked. He's speaking about Vietnamization in glowing terms. It's like, hey, look, the experiment worked. South Vietnam, we can do it. This book, Lam Son 719, is published before the end of the war, so you don't have, the after-action report of the entire conflict with all the context. This is an after-action report after this one specific operation. So I find it very interesting and honestly a bit confusing when Major General Hien writes about South Vietnamese soldiers in this operation in Laos, because I don't know if it's representative of the whole. I get the sense it's probably not. But again, I'm a fan of history, not necessarily a historian, so I can't give that my stamp of approval and say this is for sure a fact based on, all these other things. I will say this, though. It seems a bit conspicuous. As decision makers in Washington, decision makers at MACV in Saigon, South Vietnamese generals, they're all putting their heads together to try and figure out what the best use of South Vietnamese military is. The best test for Vietnamization. There's a couple different options. You could send them into the Central Highlands. You could send them into the Southern Theater. You could do a lot of different things with the South Vietnamese military. I mean, we already talked about it. There's near 1 million men. But what they decide to do is an operation that punches into Laos targeting the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Ever since the Ho Chi Minh Trail was set up in the First Indochina War, it has been the artery of supply for the North Vietnamese. In fact, you could argue now, like the armchair historians that we are, looking back on this, many, many decades ago, you could say Ho Chi Minh Trail is the single most important aspect or piece of territory that is worth fighting over in the entire conflict. More important than invading North Vietnam, more important than winning the Central Highlands, because the United States' goals this entire conflict have been to remove North Vietnam's ability to resupply and constrict its military and basically suffocate it. But the problem is when you have Russia and China feeding the material, which then they are able to get from north to south consistently, you're not removing their ability to resupply and you're not choking them out. They still have a lifeline. Ho Chi Minh Trail is the lifeline. It is a trail that goes from North Vietnam and cuts through Laos and then goes down into South Vietnam. This has been an artery for years now. It's been somewhat developed. It's like this maze of walking paths and, semi-widened paths. At different points, the North Vietnamese government has instructed work teams to expand it, to pave it in parts. It's these little walking paths, and they all connect together and create one large Ho Chi Minh Trail. And I find it interesting that the thing that we're going to really see if the South Vietnamese military can stand on its own, the test is it's not a grand offensive within Vietnam itself. It's not a push up north to the DMZ, which would have been, very difficult operations to undertake. I don't know that there's any single operation you could take that would be easy per se, but the operation that they decide to do is an extremely critical operation punching into Laos. There's a lot of ramifications of an operation like this, namely if it doesn't work. If you decide to take out the Ho Chi Minh Trail and really limit the enemy's ability to resupply, again, maybe the single most important feature in the entire conflict. It also begs the question, why are we just now thinking about, debilitating the Ho Chi Minh Trail? Why are we just now thinking of doing this? I don't know. But part of this thing as well is that you're going to take out Cos Vin operations in Laos as well. So it's kind of a two birds with one stone sort of thing. Major General Heen writes about it in his book Lam Son 719. He writes, quote, "To continue supporting its war in the South, it appeared that North Vietnam would have to rely solely on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the supply route along the rugged Trong Son mountain range. Therefore, an invasion of the Laos Panhandle became an attractive idea. Such an operation would retain the initiative for the RVNAF, or the South Vietnamese military, disrupt the flow of enemy personnel and supplies to South Vietnam, and greatly reduce the enemy's capability to launch an offensive in 1971. End quote. Everybody realizes how important this is because everybody realizes it is the main artery for supply for the entire war effort. And again, it begs the question, why are we just now dealing with this in 1970? Why wasn't this considered, a viable operation in 1967? I don't have the answer to that. I'm not the military genius here, but it is, something that pops up in my head, the food for thought. The idea was that this operation would launch from the base at Khe Sanh and then would punch into Laos and eventually end up at a place, and pardon me for my pronunciation, I know it's terrible, but Chapon. This was going to be a four-pronged invasion. This was going to be a long operation, kind of like a very large, very long search and destroy operation. The other feature of this invasion of Laos is that there's no U.S. military personnel that are going to be taking part in this invasion. If you'll remember those bills that were passed by Congress, those amendments to the Constitution, they prevented U.S. troops from setting foot in Laos. So what they decide to do instead is you can't have U.S. military troops, you can't have advisors, you can't have commanders, you can't have, aircraft or anything like that. Nothing. You can't have anything. So what decision makers decide to do is set up fire bases that are along the border. And from there, you can kind of direct your chess pieces, theoretically, with U.S. military advisors. The other thing that's being considered here is the clock that is ticking on this thing. Everybody knows that U.S. military presence is going to continue dwindling. Nixon is pulling men out pretty much every opportunity that he can without endangering the war effort. And MACV knows, the South Vietnamese military knows that U.S. troops are going to continue being pulled out and sent home. And so this moment right here, where there's still several 100,000 U.S. troops in South Vietnam, that South Vietnamese military, ARVN, is probably at its strongest point. It's at its most supplied, most fresh point on paper anyway. This is the moment when everybody feels like it's a now or never moment. If we're going to do it, we might as well do it now while we still have U.S. military presence in South Vietnam in substantial enough forces that it's almost like it's a backbone. We have something we can lean on if things get a little hairy. In the interest of secrecy, the operation is planned extremely quickly, perhaps even you could say hastily. But the North Vietnamese still, they know it's coming to a certain extent. If you're looking at a battle map from a bird's eye view, and you're trying to predict what your opponent is going to do next, if you're looking at this from a Hanoi perspective, there are a few places that you know are going to get some sort of enemy attention. Central Highlands are going to be one. The DMZ is going to be another. Cambodia is going to be one, but we've already seen that happen. So our fourth option, the one that if you're looking at, it could be here, 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 or here, a fourth option for the Hanoi Politburo would obviously be Laos, because they know that the Americans and the South Vietnamese know they're resupplying with the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Again, the most important artery of supply throughout the entire conflict. Despite that, the operation does go off without a hitch for the first few days. And again, the way that Major General Heen writes about it, it gives you pause a little bit, like, did it go as well as he writes about it? Is it really how it went? Here's what he says about the first few days of the operation. Quote, "Many parts of the roads were destroyed beyond quick repair, and the engineers had to build detours. Sporadic enemy fire was received, but it was insignificant in the face of our mighty armored force and the brave airborne troops, and they advanced rapidly." End quote. You know what it sounds like to me? It sounds like Herodotus, like this romantic writer of history. And I know there's a lot of factors at play here. Major General Heen isn't just writing the events. He's playing to an audience. His audience is Americans, and the things that seem very obvious in his telling of this story, in his recap of this operation, is that he's got to please American viewers and readers. So you're going to see a lot of references to body count, measurable things that you can say, here's what we took, here's how many men we lost, here's what we gained by those men being lost. The other thing is he's going to promote how brave and how put together the South Vietnamese military is. He's going to write about this operation in the most glowing terms possible. And you kind of got to take that in and bake it into the whole thing. I was trying to find a section in Max Hastings' book about this operation, and he essentially just says, it happened. A super important operation, and you get, it happened. Which I think in the grand scheme of things, when you're looking at the entire conflict from a bird's eye view, I get it because, the results, not to spoil it, but the results of the operation are, it happened. But anyways, Major General Hien writes about the brave South Vietnamese soldiers and their push into Laos. Now, while things get going well at the start, they go off without a hitch initially, but then given the opportunity to regroup, North Vietnamese soldiers acquit themselves admirably. Major General Hien writes about this change that happens after the first couple days. Quote, "For 4 days now, reports flowed into First Corps headquarters of strong attacks that included very heavy bombardments by heavy artillery and tank attacks. Reports of ARVN losses, including the decimation of the 4th Battalion 1st Infantry, were very disturbing to General Lam, as were the many indications that the enemy was reinforcing and maneuvering to prevent the orderly ARVN withdrawal from Laos." End quote. The operation turns into a supposedly ordered withdrawal. At least that's the goal, to get them out in an orderly fashion, but it ends up happening in a bit of a chaotic fashion. Even Major General Hien, who's trying to write about this in the most glowing terms possible, says about the withdrawal that, quote, "The withdrawal along Route 9 surely did not proceed as planned in an orderly and controlled manner." End quote. It gets a little dicey there. Some helicopters. Well, most of these troops are moving around on helicopters almost entirely. And the tanks that they've got, it almost happens sort of inexplicably, at least when you're referring to Major General Hien's account of it. It seems to happen almost inexplicably, but North Vietnamese soldiers will appear out of the brush almost and attack on all sides, and tanks will be disabled, and it just goes on like that over and over again. You see many more accounts of, this tank got taken out. This little group of men that were on the ground get ambushed and taken out, and it's one after the other. Something I always think about when I'm taking into account my own perception of things is, what did I expect from it at the outset? You're reading a new book. What were the expectations going in? Watching a new movie. What were my expectations? In this case, if you're going to poll, international journalists or news media members throughout the world, what were their expectations of Lam Son 719 going in? How do those expectations shape what ends up happening? In this case, Lam Son 719 is the guinea pig, the test to see if Vietnamization works. And so it's talked up. It is talked in glowing terms. Guys, watch this. We're going to go do an operation. We're going to test this ARVN force and see if it works. So what do you think the international response to the operation was when there were pictures filtering back from war correspondents of ARVN soldiers hanging on the skids of helicopters as they're evacuating? The response is, of course, well, it didn't work. The operation was a failure for a couple reasons. The end goal was going to be a place called Chapon. Well, they inhabited Chapon for a brief minute, and it wasn't for any tactical reasons. It was for a saving face kind of a reason. Forces got near, and they brought in President Tu to kind of ask him what they should do next. Again, this is a slow-moving kind of an operation. It's not a, from point A to point Z, it doesn't happen all in one day. It builds upon itself. They bring in President Tu and say, should we go in here and capture Chapon? And he says, well, yeah, of course. That was the goal from the outset, right? The generals nod and they go, okay, yeah, we'll go do it. They go in and they capture Chapon for like 6 hours, and then they're pushed out. And the photos start filtering back to all the different news media places throughout the world. And the pictures that are being sent are not pictures of victory. They're pictures that indicate that it didn't go well. Major General Heen, again, the picture of optimism, writes about it, quote, "The picture of ARVN soldiers hanging on the skids of a helicopter which evacuated them from Lower Laos and other equally dramatic photographs showing battered First Corps troops returning back across the Laotian border caused grave concern among South Vietnamese military and civilian alike. Their concern deepened when they read the tantalizing news articles first carried by American newspapers and magazines, then picked up by the foreign and Vietnamese press, which all reported that the ARVN incursion into Lower Laos was being terminated. The GVN military spokesman had a hard time denying these reports. He announced that this was simply an exchange of operational forces, and for all practical purposes, Lam Son 719 was still underway, and that ARVN forces were continuing their destructive forays against communist logistical bases and infiltration routes on the other side of the border. President Nguyen Van Thu echoed this line during his press conference at Dong Ha on April 1, 1971. But news about raids in Lower Laos no longer interested Vietnamese public opinion, which was more concerned about the real outcome of the well-publicized campaign. In the absence of official announcements, rumors and speculations proliferated. Everyone wanted to know the truth about friendly losses, but when official results were later made public, no one seemed to believe that they reflected the truth." End quote. Max Hastings writes about the stakes of this operation, and it's what we've been talking about. It's the give and take of testing Vietnamization, but also trying to achieve something and not lose, because losing would be incredibly damaging for the war effort at that point. Max Hastings writes, quote, "The most grievous error in which the entire U.S. leadership was complicit was failure to recognize the risk of Lam Son 19 outweighed any possible gain. If the Communists defeated an assault of this magnitude, as many officers thought likely, the whole facade of Vietnamization would totter at a time when the American political climate was deteriorating." End quote. He continues about the result of the operation, summing it up thusly, quote, "By the time the operation reached a ragged, threadbare conclusion, the South Vietnamese had fought in Laos for 42 days and lost almost half the forces committed, some 8,000 casualties, including many taken prisoner." End quote. Here's where we get the major disagreement about this operation. How successful was it? Was it successful in a body count term? Was it successful in terms of what you set out to do, and did you achieve what you set out to do? We have a lot of disagreement about how many soldiers the NVA lost. MACV estimated that 13,000 NVA had been killed. Post-war South Vietnam said that they lost 2,163 killed. And then, of course, Mr. Optimistic, Nguyen Di Hin, estimated that the NVA lost 20,000 men, or about 50% of their combat force, which is probably far too high. Max Hastings says that the post-war North Vietnam estimate of 2,163 killed and 6,000 wounded are believable numbers because it's about 13% of their combat strength. Based on how Nguyen Duy Hin writes about it, you think that perhaps they could have lost 50% of their force? But if they lost half of their force, the NVA, how is it that the South Vietnamese are retreating? This is where you have this rub of, is he writing about it extremely optimistically, or is he writing about it from a sense of somebody just reporting on the situation? And you get the sense, based on other numbers, this one is so far higher than everybody else's. I mean, MACV, they're going to be optimistic. They say 13,000. Heen is like, oh, 13,000 is optimistic? How about 20? And then North Vietnam comes in with a relatively respectable 8,200 total casualties. You can decide which of those you're going to believe. I would imagine, based on Max Hastings' assessment of the situation, the North Vietnamese estimates are closer to the truth, probably a little higher. So let's say 8 to 12,000 casualties. This operation was designed to show you how Vietnamization worked, how far it had come. It was a test. And the CIA's Frank Snepp wrote about the operation afterwards, quote, Lam Son 719 told us everything we needed to know about where Vietnamization had really got to, and it told Hanoi the same things, end quote. Kissinger's hope from this operation was that they'd have some measurable things that they'd achieved in this operation, that he could go to the Paris negotiations with Le Duc Tho and say, and have a stronger hand. Remember, he's always trying to have the strongest hand at the negotiating table. Kissinger's hoping that the ARVN forces, gain some things for him in Paris. If anything, his hand just got lighter. It got worse. Because Hanoi now realized capabilities of the ARVN force, and in the big test, the one where you really want to see how capable are you, ARVN forces came up very short. Hanoi now got the measure of its enemy, and got the measure of its enemy in a victory, which is perhaps the most dangerous outcome of this entire operation. If you were to go through all the potential outcomes here, the outcome that does end up happening is probably one of your worst case scenarios. The Vietnam War, it's one of those conflicts where things are ebbing and flowing, and it's like water rising up on a beach and then flowing back. There's this constant motion to things. Events continue to happen sort of regardless whether or not you're paying attention to them. So, Hamburger Hill happens in 1969, where U.S. infantry and ARVN forces take a hill and then lose the hill, and NVA forces, supposedly it follows a very similar tenor to a lot of other infantry battles in the war, where U.S. infantry forces lose initially, then they figure it out and they win and they inflict a lot of casualties. And the reporting after the war is that the United States wins a Pyrrhic victory. It sounds very similar to some other conflicts like Dak To, for example. But something that you see continuing to build throughout the conflict is that the war sort of spreads out. It'll expand and then contract, expand and then contract. And this is in response to the negotiations happening in Paris. Both the United States and North Vietnam want to spread each other thin. The United States thinks that, the Vietnamese might have an incredible national will, which they've demonstrated over and over again, but there's got to be a breaking point. And so the United States is trying to find that by expanding the war into Laos and Cambodia. The North Vietnamese, on the other hand, want to expand the war because they also believe the United States is pulling troops out, and they believe that the South Vietnamese are going to break if they extend the war as well. So you find that the fighting expands over into Laos, then contracts back into Vietnam as negotiations kind of present opportunities for this to happen. And even after Lam Son 719, the war for the Ho Chi Minh Trail, or the United States contact happening in and around the Ho Chi Minh Trail, doesn't end. They still realize that this is the central spot where if they're going to end fighting, they have to stop it at the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The issue is they'd probably overestimate the North's ability to wage war on very limited amounts of supply. The U.S. Air Force's reporting of the fighting in Laos says that, quote, enemy activities in South Vietnam could be sustained on as little as 60 tons of supplies a day, the equivalent of about 30 trucks worth of material, end quote. But again, the United States is pushing, trying to find a pressure point. And while they're trying to find a pressure point, the North Vietnamese feel like they've probably found the United States pressure point, the pressure point of the American people. It's not even a place that you can fight and take, tactically in North Vietnam, the weak point of the entire U.S. fight is back home. We mentioned earlier Jane Fonda's trip to North Vietnam in 1972, where she comes out, she's a celebrity, she comes out and supports North Vietnam. Or at least what she does is not necessarily a tacit support. Some people would argue it is. It's a denouncing of U.S. troops, which in a lot of cases means tacit support for the North Vietnamese. If you're not with us, you're against us, sort of a thing. And I think in a lot of ways, she probably was with the North Vietnamese, because if you reduce the war to a singular black and white polarity, if you say, well, the United States is bad, therefore our enemies must be good, right? So she goes to North Vietnam and is recorded and has this weird moment when she's interacting with North Vietnamese troops, and she delivers speeches and stuff. She kind of becomes a mascot, and the North Vietnamese are very good about this. They take anything that they can latch onto and they turn it into propaganda. They're amazing at this. And when they find out that Jane Fonda is against U.S. troops because of the atrocities that have been reported that the U.S. troops are doing, she becomes the mascot for the North Vietnamese, becomes hated by the Americans, but becomes a mascot for the North Vietnamese. And in so doing, it by degrees reduces the United States' ability to acquire social capital to continue waging the war. Another thing that the North Vietnamese do is they comply with the United States' wish to expand the war into Laos. It works both ways, where the United States can expand the war into Laos and hinder North Vietnamese ability to wage the war theoretically, but also it'll cut the other way too, that the North Vietnamese know that politically it's becoming a really tenuous situation for Nixon's administration to wage the war, to convince the country that what he's doing, it's going to work because, what they put in, they'll get X out of it. That part of it's becoming incredibly difficult for Nixon's administration. And so the North Vietnamese, they want to expand the war into Laos as well, because they feel like if they keep pushing, if they keep expanding the war and then contracting it, that it will make it incredibly difficult for Nixon to maintain his power in the United States. Meanwhile, on the ground, a change has been slowly happening to the soldiers fighting, if people have been paying attention to it. Problem is, nobody was. But there's this change that's happening because the soldiers, they're not stupid. They can see the writing on the wall. They can see that after 1968, this thing was all just a matter in how it was going to be wrapped up. And so discipline, army morale goes down the tank. It's something that you can imagine on a human level, but thinking about discipline in the United States military, there's an expectation, I guess, for what it is, that it is very disciplined, that it is very put together. And something that comes out about this war is just that it was a bit of an illusion, that discipline does not supersede human nature, that human nature, when things are going terrible, is not to throw your life away for something stupid. Discipline in the U.S. Army gets really bad for several reasons. It's for racial strife. You've got the civil rights movement happening back in the United States that is extended to Vietnam. So you have issues there as well, but you also have drug abuse, decline of discipline, maybe because of drug abuse, but maybe because of the political nature of the war, that soldiers feel like their lives are going to be thrown away for, something stupid to be decided in Paris. A U.S. general said about it later that, quote, "We went into Korea with a rotten army and came out with a fine one. We went into Vietnam with a great army and finished with a terrible one." End quote. U.S. military police made 11,000 drug arrests in 1969, and nearly 60% of grunts of regular soldiers smoked pot by 1971. Soldiers have to deal with the stuff that they're seeing. They got to figure out a way to compartmentalize it. And this is before mental health is even a discussion or much of a thing. And soldiers are trying to find ways to escape from it. And what they're doing is, instead of drinking, where you could be off your head and unable to fight if the Vietnamese show up, they started smoking pot. And it's easier to come by. It's cheaper in Vietnam than it would have been in the United States. The black markets in Vietnam have some of the best drugs that soldiers would have ever seen, and it's far cheaper than anything they would find in the United States. I remember there was a story of one of my relatives who fought in the war, and he said that he smoked pot because you couldn't drink because you never knew when the Vietnamese were going to attack. So you had to stay ready, and you had to be able to operate your rifle if they were going to attack your base. And you could do that while smoking pot. You could be high and you could fight. You couldn't fight if you were drunk. So a lot of soldiers were getting high to deal with the issues that they were having, to deal with the fact that they were, thousands of miles away from their home, that everybody hated them back home, that they were fighting in a war and seeing terrible things as a result of that war constantly. Max Hastings writes about this atrophying of the United States Army in 1960, 1970, and 1971. He writes, quote, "In the course of 1971, many U.S. Army and Marine Corps units atrophied, amid tensions created by disaffection, race, drugs, and a competition to avoid becoming the last American to die in a cause widely believed to be discredited. An illusion spread that men were entitled to resign from the struggle if they felt that way. In March of 1971, 53 Marines near Khe Sanh refused combat, yet faced no disciplinary action. Soldiers at FSB Pace rejected orders to patrol. Word traveled of such gestures, infecting other units. An extreme manifestation was the disaster that unfolded at Firebase Mary Ann on the night of March 27th and 28th, 1971, in which 30 of its residents, few could be justly described as defenders, were killed and 82 wounded." End quote. Just to give you a picture of how much of a mess this battalion is, one of the men ate a C4 plastic explosive after being told that it would help get him high. He died, as well as 3 others. Private First Class James Creven said about the Mary Ann, about the soldiers fighting there in that battalion, quote, "We weren't stupid. We knew we were pulling out, and we knew that the ARVN weren't going to fight their own war. Why risk your life for people who won't even appreciate you being there? The only ones who wanted to be there were career officers. Anybody who was gung-ho and wanted to kill gooks was incredibly suspect." End quote. Max Hastings adds, after this quote in his book, Vietnam, he adds, quote, "Out on ambush, Creven and his kin were content to let the enemy come and go unscathed." And then quoting Creven again, "These people never did a damn thing to me." End quote. This is a common thing where troops don't want to be the last guys there. They don't want to be the last guy killed for something foolish, what they feel is foolish. They also don't feel like, continuing the war when they feel like the war is almost over. There's an anecdote from Max Hastings where in 1971, a soldier named Rob Franklin and a few of his men come in contact with North Vietnamese troops, and they chased them into a rubber plantation. And as the sun is setting and light is fading, it's almost night, Franklin ordered his men to stop. His sergeant, Arthur Francis, asked him, quote, "What are we doing, sir?" End quote. And then Rob Franklin says, quote, "They've come this far. Let 'em go. Let's go home." End quote. That's a common sentiment. Lots of guys are thinking, what's the point? Why am I going to go, ruin my conscience for something that's just going to end anyway? The line that's often uttered is what Creven would say. They didn't do anything to me. Why am I going to go, do something to them? For the troops at Mary Ann, there's like a failure of leadership to the point that soldiers are just sitting around reading newspapers, playing cards. There's a quote from Captain Paul Spielberg when he writes home about the battalion. He says, quote, "This company really is a mess. The troops sit around reading newspapers, playing cards. Most of the time, they don't even carry their weapons." End quote. Then Someone wrote about Spielberg later, quote, "Spielberg used to get on us lieutenants for being good guys with the troops, but if I'd gone in with the attitude that I was the lieutenant and you're going to do what I said, I might have gotten fragged." End quote. We even have instances where troops who have officers that they don't particularly care for, those officers might actually forfeit their life for doing their job. If you stay on your guys to do what they're supposed to do, those guys might just drop a grenade in the toilet that you frequent. They might put one in your bunk. You never know. There's many instances of lieutenants or captains or majors getting fragged by their soldiers. If the soldier feels like the guy has it out for him, he might just frag him. So it adds a whole new element when you have officers who feel like they can't even tell their guys what to do because their guys might just kill them. This effort to not die might have been the thing that killed soldiers at the Marianne. Max Hastings tells us what happens to these men, quote, "Some 50 sappers wearing only green shorts, their exposed bodies blackened with grease and charcoal, launched a meticulously planned attack. They came from the southwest, slithering forward to cut 4 large gaps first in outer double concertina wire, then in the inner 2 barriers, which were ill-maintained. They lay for some time just in front of the bunkers, awaiting a mortar barrage that was the signal to attack. The first the Americans knew of these terrifying apparitions was a storm of satchel charges, grenades, CS gas canisters, and AK-47 fire in the darkness, which precipitated panic and paralysis. Captain Knight was ignominiously killed inside his bunker, along with his communications sergeant. The NVA charged through the firebase, shooting and bombing with cold efficiency, lobbing explosives into each hooch in turn, while 2 demolition teams raced for the artillery positions on the crest." End quote. All of this because the men supposed to be guarding Marianne were in their hooches, playing cards, reading newspapers, doing all the things they're not supposed to do, not carrying their weapons. So officers are befuddled when bombs start going off, grenades start going off, gas starts filtering through the compound. They start asking questions like, where's the guards? How could this happen? Well, the guards were reading newspaper, taking showers, playing cards, sleeping. It leaves officers asking questions like, what are they thinking? Creighton Abrams even has a quote where he says the very thing. He says, quote, "It was a failure of command. They had the intelligence. I don't know what the hell they were thinking of," end quote. Max Hastings offers an explanation. Quote, "They were thinking of going home. A month after the attack on Marianne, the Americans quit the hill forever." End quote. It's things like this that make you realize how difficult it is to withdraw from a conflict, which is essentially what the United States have been trying to do since the Tet Offensive in 1968. At this point in the story, we're into the 70s, multiple years after the Tet Offensive, and the war is really no closer to ending than it was after 1968. Withdrawing is really hard. That's the thing you kind of pull out of this, that Kissinger and Leducto have been negotiating now for a while, and they haven't gotten to a point where the conditions are ripe for either one of them to really pursue an end to negotiations, to pursue peace. You might wonder, like, what are they doing? What's taking so long? And it's both sides are trying to find the optimal situation on the ground that would precipitate an end to the war, because they're trying to get the best possible conditions in a peace agreement or acceptable conditions to their governments. And the governments are pressing on both of the negotiators, telling them, you need to get a certain set of conditions. Well, how do you get a certain set of conditions? Things have to change on the ground. So you're kind of waiting for things to change on the ground to the point where you can really, press the go button on negotiations and get to the point where you feel like you've actually done what you set out to do. For Kissinger, these negotiations are directly representative of Americans' power on the world stage. For the North Vietnamese, they are unflinching. Le Duan will be talking to Le Duc Tho, and there's we're going to get this result and only this result. Anything else is failure. So if you can't get that result, don't even bother trying to come to any sort of conclusion to this thing. We can keep fighting, as the saying says, until the cows come home. They have no issues continuing to fight a war that is, incredibly difficult for their people, incredibly difficult for their economy, because they've been doing it now for 30 years. It's almost all they know. Which is almost another thing that's crazy to think about, is the fact that the Vietnamese have been operating in a wartime economy, in a wartime society, for so long that it's almost all they know. To the point that, and maybe, I don't know, I'm assuming here, I may be speaking out of school, but if it's all you know, it doesn't seem so unpalatable to continue it, even though it is unpalatable, because it's all you know. You're used to it. You have acclimated yourself to the privations of war, maybe better than the United States ever could. Kissinger and Nixon later on have to decide, are they going to allow some sort of a North and South coalition government, at least in negotiations on paper? And again, they know, just like everybody else knows, that as soon as you leave, the North Vietnamese are going to overthrow the South Vietnamese government. They've been incredibly consistent from the outset. Everybody knows that they're going to overthrow President Thu and his South Vietnamese government. They're going to replace it with a unified North Vietnam, but it's going to be all of Vietnam. It's going to be a communist government over the entire country. Everybody knows this. It's no secret. And this has been so unpalatable because of the lingering effects of the domino theory. That idea from the 50s that if North Vietnam unites under a communist regime, they're going to be buddy-buddy with China, with the Soviet Union, and then communism is going to take over the world, and the Cold War is going to result in, the East versus West, good guys versus the Sith, the Jedi versus the Sith, right? So a coalition government is off the table, even though now by this point, we're in 1970, 1971. By this point, the idea of the domino theory is a little bit more tenuous. It's on tenuous ground. Because we now have multiple years of the United States pressing on Vietnam, and China and the Soviet Union are offering assistance to the Vietnamese, but they're not sending ground troops, across the DMZ to engage American soldiers. This isn't like Korea. And it's because the Chinese and the Soviets have realized how, post-Cold War, great powers are going to continue fighting their wars. They're not going to do it with their soldiers. They're going to do it through proxies. They'll support the Vietnamese, forever, as long as it'll weaken the Americans. But they're not going to send Chinese or Soviet troops in there because you're not going to go into a World War III sort of situation. And in a lot of ways, while nuclear scares are, terrifying to people on the ground, it also is a little bit of a backbone as people realize we're not going to start a nuclear war. You have the questions. Everybody's wondering. Everybody's a little scared about nuclear war because it is terrifying. But realistically, rational decision makers of foreign countries aren't going to start a nuclear war. They're just as scared of it as the Americans are. But you don't project that. You project a position of strength. You say, we could use nuclear weapons. They have a little bit, a hair of that Nixon persona where he's like, I might just drop a bomb. Watch me. See if I do it. But everybody knows Nixon's not really going to do it. Just like the Americans know, or maybe they don't know, they find out that the Chinese aren't going to do it, that the Soviets aren't going to do it. They'll fight the war with their proxy, with the Vietnamese. This is further cemented in 1971 when Richard Nixon gains an audience with the Chinese. This is groundbreaking because if you can think about it like this, we have been operating. This entire war has been fought under presuppositions, under assumptions. Growing up, they always told me about assumptions. It makes an ass out of you and an ass out of them. assumptions obviously aren't the truth, and Nixon realizes the truth of the situation. He realizes the Chinese are not going to commit ground troops. They're not going to start a nuclear war over Vietnam. That changes everything for him. He comes away from this meeting in 1971 thinking, oh, well, we can press our advantage. We can bomb them into the Stone Age. We can do just about anything because China's not going to intervene. We can actually try and win the war. Now the only thing he's got to be concerned about is public opinion in the United States and getting reelected. So no longer the giant fear is China and Russia. It's just back home, public opinion. The military theorist Clausewitz has that maxim where he says that wars are an extension of political policy, or it's policy by another means. If you can't get it done in the halls of power, soldiers will help you do it. If you press your enemy into a certain contorted situation, he'll agree to whatever policies you want him to. Colonel Lung of the RVN wrote later about Vietnamization, about how its policy by other means didn't quite align with what the RVN, with what South Vietnam thought was actually the case. Colonel Lung writes, quote, Vietnamization was more than modernization and expansion of the RVNAF. It was essentially a strategy that would require the Vietnamese to survive with greatly reduced American participation. Had President Tu and the Joint General Staff fully realized this fact, perhaps they would have begun to then build a strategy to cope with it. Instead, the RVNF made no adjustments in doctrine, organization, or training to compensate for the departure of American troops and firepower. End quote. Colonel Harry Summers, who I love his little book on strategy where he just writes about strategic and tactical, it's a military manual looking at the Vietnam War. And he writes about this meeting in China and what it meant for policy. He writes, quote, the strategy of containment of communism in Asia lost its focus with the 1971 presidential visit to China. Not only that, as Norman Podhoretz argues, Vietnamization was actually, now quoting Podhoretz, the model or paradigm of a new strategy of retreat, end quote. Vietnam was supposed to be that testing ground of that new strategy of containment through surrogate power. But, now quoting Podhoretz again, in the case of Vietnam, not only was the surrogate power unable to hold the line on its own, but in the event, the United States refused even to provide it with the promised aid to defend itself against a military invasion encouraged and supplied with massive quantities of Soviet arms. End quote. Summers then quotes Clausewitz, the military theorist himself, about coalition warfare, where Clausewitz points out plainly exactly what's happening here in Vietnam now a couple hundred years after Clausewitz put out his military theories. Summers quotes Clausewitz, quote, one country may support another's cause, but it will never take it so seriously as it takes its own. A moderately sized force will be sent to its help. But if things go wrong, the operation is pretty well written off, and one tries to withdraw at the smallest possible cost. End quote. But again, withdrawal is tough. It's not as easy as just saying we want to withdraw. You have to get the conditions just right. On both sides. The North Vietnamese have to get the conditions just right to where they feel comfortable. The United States have to get conditions right where they feel comfortable. And when you are at two opposing ends of, the spectrum on what you want to get done, the North Vietnamese, what they want pretty much opposes what the United States want, what Kissinger wants. So you have these, marathon meetings in Paris where it turns into, instead of actually deciding about what the policy is going to be, what the treaty is going to look like, you've got these reported meetings where Le Duc Tho will launch into these tirades where he's just lambasting the United States and Kissinger for the things that they've done. literally just trying to wear him out, trying to wear Kissinger down so that he'll just acquiesce. He'll be like, fine, whatever you want, we'll do it. Making every single point such a point of contention that it's almost easier just to acquiesce to it than it is to continue the argument. Both sides have different ideas about how they can get the negotiation situation into the right climate for achieving the goals that they want. Nixon and the United States think that if they bomb further, if they increase the bombing to a certain point, the Vietnamese will come to a point where they realize they must agree to the United States. Again, they've been saying this now for decades. If we do this, we'll get this output. The problem is there's something broken in the calculus of this whole situation. I mean, when Nixon came into office, analysts put in all the factors of the war. They said the enemy has this and this and this, and we have this and this and this, and, when should the war be over? And the computer program says, you won the war already. Analysts scratch their heads, go, nope, we hadn't won the war already. Something's wrong in the calculus, but they don't know what it is. And so decision makers, analysts, they continue making these predictions where they say, if we do this, the enemy will do this. The enemy never does what they say the enemy will do in these predictions. But they say if we increase the bombing, the enemy will come to the negotiating table, begging for it to be over. Spoiler alert, folks, they don't. Le Duan and the Hanoi Politburo also have their own ideas about how they can, come to the negotiating table in a position of power. And it's no surprise either. They play the greatest hits just like the Americans do. The Americans continue bombing and saying if we bomb them to a certain extent, they'll come to the negotiating table. They never do. Whereas the North Vietnamese, they have their own flavor of the exact same issue where they say if we have, a grand offensive, a general uprising, a general offensive like Tet, which Le Duan has been trying to put together for years, multiple times. He tried it in 1964, did it in 1968, and in 1972, he decides the time is ripe to do it again. 4 years have gone by since Tet. The manpower calculus of this has bounced back a little bit to the point where Le Duan feels like the time is ripe to try it again. Something you'll notice when you read the source material about the 1972 North Vietnamese offensive is that nobody knows for sure who's calling the shots. It's a bit more murky than things were in 1968 during the Tet Offensive, when you could make credible arguments that it was Le Duan calling the shots, even though at the time on the ground, people thought that General Zapp was calling the shots. You see that a lot of times with the quotes that people are making. They're like, oh, Zapp's got a good one. Zapp did really good. The strategy is go for broke. Because as you're making decisions or reacting to the strategy that your enemy, comes out with, you don't really know exactly who is calling the shots because it is a closed-off political system, the Politburo up in Hanoi. You kind of are reacting to tendencies. And so in 1968, with this big unit warfare that they end up kind of going with, people say, oh, that's kind of like Zapp, so it's Zapp. Well, the 1972 offensive is even more murky than 68, because where you have credible sources where you can point to Le Duan is calling the shots in 1968, you don't have as much of that with 1972. There's arguments among different historians. Lien Hong Nguyen would argue that Le Duan was calling the shots in 1972 as he was in 1968, but even then there's room for divisions there. There's room for arguments to be made for different people to be calling the shots. She writes in her book about it, Hanoi's War, quote, equally important to the origins and timing surrounding the 1972 offensive are the questions of who devised strategy and for what ends. During the war, American analysts assumed that the Politburo member and president of the National Assembly, Trong Chin, was the main strategist, since he delivered a key speech during the Third Congress of the Vietnam Fatherland Front on December 17, 1971, that foreshadowed communist strategy for 1972. In his speech, Trong Chinh called for using main force units to deliver a crushing blow to the enemy troops. During the war, Foreign Service Officer Douglas Pike argued that Trong Chinh could not have devised VWP strategy for 1972 since the Politburo leader had long been an advocate of protracted struggle. Instead, Pike suggested that the offensive was the brainchild of Defense Minister General Vo Nguyen Giap, the hero of Dien Bien Phu, who had long preferred high-technology big-unit battles. Historian Dale Andrade, however, insists that General Giap's brief ascendancy as the result of the 1971 victory in Laos was insufficient to give him command of PAVN operations, and that instead it was General Van Tien Dung who was in charge of planning the 1972 Communist offensive. Major General Nguyen Dinh Ngoc, former head of the Vietnam Institute of Military History, claimed the Politburo collectively devised strategy and aimed only to change the balance of power militarily on the ground and not to alter the international picture. End quote. Where the 1972 offensive will differ from previous offensives, though, is that the arms and armor, the infantry-armor combination, is going to be very different than previous offensives. In 1964 and 1968, the Vietnamese didn't have armor. They've never really had an air force, but they didn't have this combined infantry and armor sort of a thing that they've been able to develop in the years since 1968. They got to use armor a little bit in Laos, and it was incredibly important in repelling the Lam Son 719 operation. But now they get to use armor on the offensive, which is something that is incredibly difficult to deal with if done effectively. You also get to add in the same flavor of warfare the Vietnamese have been using over and over and over again, which is wave attacks, and wave attacks. It's also very interesting because you have different ideas about how these fights should be conducted. Giap is a little bit more of a European mind in terms of military strategy, whereas Le Duan his military strategy is directly tied to ideology. He believes that if the people are properly, ideologically trained, that they will do whatever he tells them to do. And so he is somewhat of the opinion you just pile the bodies. As long as you achieve the goal at the end of it, it doesn't really matter. Strategically speaking, this is not the most efficient way to get done what you want to get done, but it all dovetails with the entire ideology of the Communist Party there in Hanoi. So it's a very ideologically based form of waging warfare, whereas you have other generals and policymakers in Hanoi that would disagree, but when Le Duan is the top dog, you end up somewhat doing whatever he tells you to do. Where 1972 is a bit different is now they have tanks, and the strategy is a blend of a Giap sort of a strategy and a Le Duan sort of a strategy. I've got a map of the offensive in front of me, and it looks very similar to the 1968 offensive. It looks very similar to the eventual 1975 offensive. It's an incredibly difficult, if you take it on its face, and sometimes I'll say if you remove all the context and all this stuff, it's a very difficult sort of a offensive to execute because there are so many targets that you're trying to hit simultaneously. I'm looking here on a map and I see 7 to 10. Now, these are organized in varying levels of importance. Ultimately, if you are the Hanoi Politburo, you're trying to topple the South Vietnamese government. That is goal number one. And so in order to do that, you're going to press towards Saigon. But you also want to capture Hue. You also want to capture Da Nang. You also want to get Quang Tri. All these different provinces, you're going to attack An Loc. There's many different places that are very, very important that you don't currently hold, that if everything goes according to plan, you will hold. But you got to keep in mind that there's a lot of different places that you're trying to hit all at once. And this is the exact same thing that was done in 1968, partly why it's so difficult, or was so difficult, for that offensive to work, why it ultimately failed. Because you are spreading your forces out over many different objectives, And very similar to 1968, you get this fugue state where you get the orders that come in, they filter down from, top down, and they say, go capture fill in the blank place. And then the troops go, okay, and they go do it. This is where Lamson 719 is so important, because by the time that the spring of 1972 rolls around, there's only 6,000 U.S. combat troops in South Vietnam. The Vietnamization question, the calculus, is going to be put to the test ultimately here in 1972, because there's no U.S. troops to fall back on. There's even fewer than there were in 1971, just a mere 6,000. You can't do a whole lot with 6,000 combat troops. There are quite a few analysts, but only 6,000 combat troops. So if this is going to work, if South Vietnam is going to stand on its own, yes, Lamson 719 was the trial run. This is the real deal. Creighton Abrams knows something's coming. He's in Saigon, and he can smell it. You can get the sense that there's a buildup. There's been tanks sighted. He gets the sense that there's going to be some sort of an offensive from Hanoi. The question is when, and where are they going to hit, and how hard. And very similar to how William Westmoreland operated prior to the Tet Offensive, there was lingering ideas that there was going to be an offensive in 1968. The issue for Westmoreland then was that he believed that it was going to happen in a place that it ultimately did not end up happening in, and he bet all of his chips on that prediction. Whereas with Creighton Abrams, he's a bit more strategic about things, I guess you could say. He has some quotes where he's saying things like, we know they're up to something, we just don't know when. And of course, Creighton Abrams is of the belief that it's going to happen over the Tet holiday, the Lunar New Year. When nothing happens at Tet, you get this fugue, or this calm before the storm, where American troops on the ground, they know something's coming. They don't know where it's going to come from. They don't know how hard it's going to hit. They don't know where the Vietnamese are going to attack, but everybody kind of knows. There's this feeling, this sense that you get, something's happening. I can smell it in the air, like, the air before the thunderstorm. But then they just have to wait. And they wait. And they wait. Until Easter. The attack is simultaneously all over South Vietnam. It concentrates in one place called An Loc, where Max Hastings describes the silence before the storm, the calm before the storm, before the communists attack An Loc, a city with civilians inside of it and also the South Vietnamese troops defending it. He writes, quote, "There followed a brief pause before the communist onslaught, during which a ranger officer watched townspeople continue about their daily business as government loudspeaker trucks cruised the streets, urging them to stay calm, promising that reinforcements were coming, telling them to report sightings of communist infiltrators immediately. When the North Vietnamese opened their bombardment, there was no pretense of respecting civilian life. 122mm rockets and 155mm shells from guns captured at Loc Ninh rained down on every quarter of the city. A Southern officer wrote, quote, now quoting the officer, agonizing screams, bodies and body parts blown everywhere and even hanging from branches and rooftops spelled tragedy. Many civilians took refuge in army bunkers." End quote. Hastings continues, up to 2,000 artillery and mortar rounds a day fell on An Loc. End quote. The feature of the 1972 Easter Offensive is that the communist forces will pepper a place with artillery and then come in with combined infantry and armor. Hastings writes about how this happened at An Loc. He writes, quote, "At 02:30 on April 13th, the communists launched their first major ground attack. The spearhead tanks at first caused consternation." He's quoting a defender. The defender says, quote, "Our soldiers were terrified," end quote. Then Hastings continues, but then a regional forces unit destroyed one with a LAW rocket. The garrison began to see that the tracked monsters were highly vulnerable in city streets, and they knocked out tank after tank with American aircraft joining in. Northern armored crews showed themselves pitifully inept. In early morning darkness, one T-54 plunged into a bomb crater. Its companions made a disastrous tactical error, speeding on alone into the city where they were destroyed piecemeal by LAW rockets and airstrikes. By 0830, with 7 NVA tanks gone, the survivors turned back. End quote. The feature of the invasion is that they've got tanks where they haven't had them before. But the issue is they're not using tanks in the correct way. I had to go look this up to be able to speak on it, but tanks are used in a combined sort of a way with infantry, where infantry can cover tanks and tanks can help you maneuver around an enemy, flank an enemy. So you can use tanks because they're much quicker than running, but you use with, the defenders are going to use rockets or things like that to disable the tanks. The infantry can cover the tanks from rocket fire from defenders, and then the tanks are going to be used in a maneuverability sort of a way. So in this combined way, you get the best out of the tanks and the best out of your infantry. Well, the Vietnamese, that NVA, don't use their tanks this way. Advisor during this An Loc battle, Captain Hal Moffett, would write later about it, quote, "The communists didn't use their tanks properly, and thank God for that. If they had used a good coordinated attack, they would have rolled right on through. But they were completely disorganized. Until this day, I don't understand what they were trying to do with the tanks, sending in 4 or 5 at a time." End quote. The traditionally accepted best practice for using tanks is to send them in waves. So all at once, doing everything but the kitchen sink sort of an attack with your tanks. The NVA aren't doing this. They're sending them in almost as probing, a probing action to get in there. But then when you do sort of this probing thing, you don't get the benefit of having the infantry cover them. And so it creates this scenario where you're getting the worst out of your tanks and you're opening them up to rocket fire from defenders, which is what the South Vietnamese are doing. But what is the greatest feature of the NVA army of the North Vietnamese? We've talked about this ad nauseum almost. What's their greatest feature? It's resilience. In the face of perhaps less than ideal tactics, in the face of less than ideal strategy at times, the calling card of the NVA is resilience, something that maybe nobody else is able to replicate the same way they are. The tank strategy doesn't work. And An Loc sort of operates as a microcosm of this entire invasion, right? The tank strategy doesn't work, and so the North Vietnamese troops regroup and they decide we're going to try again. Max Hastings writes about this regroup, quote, "However, the communist leaders at An Loc remained implacable. Having committed themselves, they refused to brook failure. On May 11th, reinforced with 35 new tanks, they launched another attack by 5 regiments advancing from 4 directions. In the headquarters bunker, the South Vietnamese could hear NVA tank engines as smoke and dust drifted through the fighting holes. An American advisor warned his Vietnamese interpreter, 'I should tell you, we may not be able to hold, so if you want to save your neck, stick with me and be ready to go.' In An Loc, as elsewhere, the decisive force attested by Hal Moffett was air power that broke up attack after attack. A daisy cutter, a big bomb, stopped a battalion. Their leaders were hollering to the American unit to get up and attack, charge, screaming at them. We could hear them, but the people wouldn't attack. We annihilated the northeastern penetration up there. I saw them running. We could have won the battle that day. We had the NVA running, but everything stopped for 3 hours." End quote. The common theme coming out of the defense of An Loc is that the Southerners, the South Vietnamese, probably could have decisively won had they continued to press their advantage. Again, we're getting this from American sources afterward, from advisors who were there telling the South Vietnamese what to do, and then struggling with an apathy, perhaps, from the South Vietnamese, not getting done what the Americans think they should get done. So this creates a scenario where the sourcing is a bit biased, and you have to read between the lines a little bit, but the South Vietnamese have a chance to win here at An Loc, and they eventually do. They create a scenario where the North Vietnamese can't press through the outer defenses, but it is within a hair's breadth of a sort of a thing. It's a near-run thing, as they say. There's a quote where Hal Moffat, the same guy we've been quoting, they asked him, could they sustain another attack like that? And he responded in this conversation, quote, "No, sir, there's too many holes in the line, and they are too weak. If the communists came in like they did last time, in my opinion, next time they're going to have their shit together. I don't think the Southerners would stay." End quote. The casualties at the Battle for An Loc are incredible. And keep in mind, this is one of 6 or 7 such battles throughout this Easter offensive. Casualty numbers for the South Vietnamese are around 12,000, but for the North Vietnamese, for the invaders, they lose somewhere in the neighborhood of 25,000 men and 35 tanks. Again, this is a microcosm of the entire offensive, and it sounds a lot like previous offensives, doesn't it? It is an everything but the kitchen sink sort of an invasion, and initially you'll get reports that things are going pretty well because it's the element of surprise, and then the North Vietnamese are so good at regrouping. They figure it out as things go on, but you take so many casualties that at a certain point it becomes debilitating. The other thing, too, with offensives like this is that you need to achieve your strategic and tactical goals quickly. Because if you get caught into a mire and you start losing too many casualties, it turns into the sort of a thing where your ability to continue the fighting is contingent upon the ability to waste human lives. And if you have a cap on how many lives you can actually spend in pursuit of your goals, well, there comes a point where there's a soft ceiling on an offensive like this. If there's only so many lives you can spend, well, the amount of lives you can spend, there's a time horizon. Once you get to that point, it kind of ruins your ability to continue fighting. Lin Hong Nguyen writes in her book, Hanoi's War, about the offensive, quote, "By early June, the South Vietnamese army had blunted the attack on Hue and had turned the tide of the fighting in the RVN's favor following the battle for An Loc and Kon Tum in the Central Highlands, during which massive PAVN attacks were decisively repelled." When she says PAVN, she's meaning the People's Army of Vietnam, or the NVA. She continues, quote, "By late summer, the ARVN launched counterattacks and was able to recapture Quang Tri City. The 1972 offensive once again failed to bring about a general insurrection to topple the Saigon regime." End quote. After the initial repulsing of the offensive, the South Vietnamese convene together and they decide to counterattack in the Quang Tri province. They launch an operation called Lam Son 72 under the leadership of General Trong, and they capture Quang Tri. They do so after several months of fighting. It's bloody fighting. It's, fighting that costs them dearly, but they do retake Quang Tri province in September 1972. Le Duan wrote about how the attacks went and the results of them, and how they were very different than in 1968. Le Duan writes, quote, "Our strategy for the military offensive, which is now in its 4th month," he's writing this in August, "remains to carry on the offensive and uprising and to annihilate and smash the puppet army. Even though we have defeated a large part of the puppet's main force units, the regional and popular forces have not been destroyed. Moreover, although the military offensive is progressing well, the masses have still not risen up in large portion. Today, the situation in the countryside differs greatly from the one during the Tet Offensive. After years of pacification, the enemy's goal is to subjugate the masses and force them into military service. Approximately 70 to 80% of families have a member who has been conscripted as a result." End quote. What Le Duan's doing there is he's covering his bases. He's covering his butt. He's saying things like, oh, the enemy has, more forces than we can deal with. The situation is very different than it was in 1968. It's really not all that different from the situation in 1968 if you think about it in terms of a, brass tacks kind of a way. The result is much the same because, like during the Tet Offensive, the countryside, the peasantry don't rise up and partner with the NVA main force units to converge on any main urban areas. There is no grand insurrection like what Lezuan wants to happen. He chalks it up in 1972 to the fact that the South Vietnamese have, gotten there first, that they've infiltrated the countryside and they got to the peasants, and now the peasants have sent all their young men into the South Vietnamese army, which technically is true, but when you spin the facts in a certain sort of a way, it makes it sound like it didn't work the way we thought it would. Problem was, it probably would have never worked in the first place. You got to remember, this is now the third time the grand insurrection idea has been put forward and paired with a massive offensive. It happened in 1964 and did not work. It happened in 1968 and did not work. And now it's happened once again in 1972 and did not work. But that's not to say that it didn't work at all, because like what happened in 1968, a massive offensive like this does have strategic implications. Maybe tactically you lose, like in 68, and maybe you spend enormous amounts of human capital, like in 1968, but there are strategic implications for offensives like this, because getting the attention of the United States will bring them to the negotiating table in Paris. And Lezuan turns his attention towards the talk part of his talk-fight strategy that he's been operating under for the past couple of years. Max Hastings writes about the 1972 offensive and its effects, quote, "The outcome of the great battles of 1972 was a tactical victory for the South, one at the cost of 11,000 men killed, perhaps 50,000 casualties in all. Most of the 300 Americans who fell that year perished during the spring offensive. The Northerners' casualties probably exceeded 100,000. They lost over half of their committed armored force, at least 250 tanks, and most of their heavy artillery. Some 25,000 civilians were killed, collateral damage impressive even by the standards of Vietnam. The Chinese bitterly criticized Hanoi for overreaching itself," now quoting the Chinese, a cadre. "Our military men said that they had lost Quang Tri because of Lezuan's orders to take Hue." End quote. Hastings continues, "The North Vietnamese Politburo was well satisfied with the outcome of its campaign. Saigon's armed forces had made their last serious stand. Thereafter, morally exhausted, most proved capable only of flirting with war." End quote. Lezuan and Le Duc Tho take the effects of the 1972 offensive to be positive because they think that they've put themselves in a better place for the negotiations in Paris. The United States aren't going to give up easy either. They don't have any combat troops in the field, but they have realized that their air war, that they, the military forces in the air that they've got in South Vietnam help turn the tide for the South. And Richard Nixon, remember, he's a hawk. He's not going to just go belly up and let everything kind of slip through his fingers. He's going to respond. He responds in a Nixonian kind of a way by putting together an operation called Operation Linebacker. If you'll remember, we mentioned an operation earlier on in this program called Duck Hook. And the principal reason why Duck Hook ended up not getting any traction was that it also featured nuclear weapons tactically placed. Again, going back to like the McNamara kind of a way about talking about nuclear weapons. It's, a nuclear weapon here or there, tactically placed, could turn the tide, yada, yada. I always love the tactically placed phrasing whenever you bring up, the nuclear weapons aspect of some of these potential operations. Everybody's worried about starting off World War III And, nuclear scares have always been something on the fringes of everybody's kind of consciousness. And we're just talking casually about potentially dropping a nuke here or there. I know Nixon's whole persona for the, first good part of this was, I'm crazy, I might do anything. Kind of like a Gary Busey. That's how I think about him, right? The Gary Busey who's, off with the launch codes in his hand, like, I might do it. I might just do it. Well, Duck Hook ended up not working because of that, but they took a lot of the other elements of Duck Hook, a prolonged sort of a bombing campaign in all parts of North Vietnam, and they they put it all back together again into an amalgamation of what Duck Hook had been, and they rebranded it Operation Linebacker. Nixon went on and told the American people that he was going to, quote, take decisive action to end the war, end quote. That decisive action comes into the tune of something like this. Max Hastings details Operation Linebacker, quote, between April and October of 1972, 155,548 tons of bombs fell on the North. Overland imports were reduced from 160,000 tons a month to 30,000, those by sea from 250,000 tons to nil. The Chinese suspended shipments and closed their railways. Linebacker wrecked almost all of North Vietnam's oil storage and 70% of its generating capacity. From the American viewpoint, the operation was far from cost-free. Many aircrew were now relatively inexperienced, and this showed in June when communist MiGs shot down 7 American fighters for the loss of only 2 of their own. Overall, Linebacker cost 44 planes. Meanwhile, though tactical air power made a devastating and almost certainly decisive impact on the southern battles, so lean and mean was the North's infrastructure that the bombing's effects on its war effort were marginal. End quote. Operation Linebacker's the most concentrated bombing of Vietnam throughout this entire war. And it does achieve its main goals of bringing Vietnam to the negotiating table. Of course, Vietnam already wanted to come to the negotiating table. They just wanted to do it from a position of strength, but after the 1972 offensive, the United States are amiable to some sort of an agreement, and after Operation Linebacker, the Vietnamese are now amiable to some sort of an agreement. The numbers on bombing in Vietnam are incredible. I think we've touched on this previously, but that 155,000 tons of bombs, it's small potatoes in the grand scheme of things because the United States themselves dropped over 5 million tons of bombs on Vietnam. To put that in perspective, that's double the entire tonnage of bombs dropped by all of the Allied forces in World War II. The devastation is incredible, and it boggles the mind. You get images like the little girl running away from a napalm bombing. She's naked and burned, and it becomes a famous photo, a photo that is, used by anti-war proponents to, show the devastation of the war, to show how the Americans are the worst, to show how they're on the wrong side of it. We're killing children. We're burning children over there. This air power, though, does have great effects to actual conventional forces in the field. It's terrible on civilians. It's terrible on the North Vietnamese economy, which is shoestring at this point. But then again, they've been getting used to this now for 30 years. But Max Hastings writes about the effects of this air power on the North Vietnamese conventional military forces. Quote, "The North Vietnamese have been taught the brutal lesson that whatever the limitations of air power against guerrillas and jungle supply lines, it was devastating to conventional forces, especially on armor caught in motion. Moreover, neglect of logistics against the advice of Giap, whose role in the campaign appears to have been administrative and honorific rather than operational, caused many gratuitous difficulties." End quote. Again, there's that question about, Giap's role in the operations. I am not at liberty to say. But it does seem to have kind of the flair of Giap, the conventional military tactics if you're going to go out on a limb and say maybe Giap had a role in this, I think it could be somewhat believed, especially after his campaigns in Laos. But regardless, the North Vietnamese retreat. Saigon's military forces are able to retake some of the territory that they've lost in this process, and everybody comes to the negotiating table ready to put an end to this long, drawn-out 30-year war. For the Vietnamese and the Americans, 1972 and reaching an agreement in 1972 is incredibly important. If you're Richard Nixon, you want to get out of the Vietnam War before the 1972 elections because you want to win your next election. And if you have prolonged, expanded the war and not gotten out of it, there's a decent chance that you might not win the elections. And the Vietnamese are incentivized to put an end to the war because there's no telling what a new president might do if there's not already a peace agreement in place. Maybe he will expand the war, and maybe a new commander-in-chief will find at that point where the North Vietnamese can't go to. Thus far, it hasn't been found. Even though the United States has gone to incredible lengths to find it, they haven't found it. But perhaps, if we let this thing go on long enough, they will find it. So Le Duc Tho and Le Duan are amiable to an agreement of some kind that puts an end to the war, and an agreement that would allow them to roll up South Vietnam, because what they have discovered is that while the United States can offer air power and sort of cover the South Vietnamese troops, and they can also direct South Vietnamese troops, if you removed, at least this is what is believed in the Hanoi Politburo, if you remove the U.S. policymakers, the generals, and the air power, and you just leave mano a mano, the North Vietnamese troops versus the South Vietnamese troops, the Hanoi Politburo believes that one is not going to be a near-run thing. They believe that they would roll up the South Vietnamese, and it wouldn't be all that difficult. With this new, assumption in place, they now feel pretty comfortable knowing what they know about the South Vietnamese. The North Vietnamese are not pressing any longer for, changes to the South Vietnamese governmental structure as part of this peace agreement. This has been a sticking point for negotiations between Kissinger and Le Duc Tho for years now, literally. The North Vietnamese want to gotten rid of. They want the United States to leave. They want to gone. So it's kind of just an open runway for them to, take over Saigon and establish their own communist state. But the United States has been pushing that, they should leave too, and as president, don't bother the South Vietnamese, at least so that it's on paper you say we didn't abandon the South Vietnamese government and sort of throw it to the wolves. Again, appearances. The North Vietnamese don't care so much about that anymore because they believe it's negligible. It doesn't matter. To or no to, they have their own aims for how this is going to end, and they believe that they will accomplish them regardless whether or not there is a South Vietnamese president named Tu or not. Linh Hong Nguyen writes about these negotiations in October of 1972, quote, "Based on the Politburo's instructions, Tho and T intended to demand a ceasefire and American withdrawal and be prepared to compromise on political issues for South Vietnam. This constituted what the United States had been pushing for since the start of the war, a two-track negotiating policy of dealing with the military issues first and allowing the South Vietnamese parties to settle internal issues later. Although Hanoi leaders stated at the time and after the war that the DRV had finally arrived at a position of strength to push for a settlement in the fall of 1972, the DRV's position was in fact more ambiguous. By October, the military balance of power in South Vietnam, the domestic picture in North Vietnam, and the international situation placed the DRV in a disadvantageous position vis-a-vis the United States and the RVN, meaning as regards to the United States and South Vietnam." She continues, quote, "Hanoi leaders shifted to prioritizing their less ambitious objectives, a ceasefire and American withdrawal, and dropped their maximum aims, toppling or getting rid of the Tu regime in order to secure a settlement before Nixon's re-election, escape any greater damage to the communist war effort, and prevent Vietnamization from further strengthening Saigon and its forces." End quote. In other words, the terms are very simple, And they don't require very much of the United States in terms of face-saving techniques or in terms of what their goals are, because by this point now, after multiple years of negotiations, Le Ducteau and company, they know what Henry Kissinger wants. They know what the United States wants. They understand how to play those buttons, right? They understand that if they sort of remove the onus from the United States on, having responsibility for how things will end after these Paris negotiations, that if they remove that the United States will acquiesce. How do we know that? I think you could make the argument that we know that because Nguyen Van Thu, president of South Vietnam in Saigon, is not made aware of what the terms of the negotiations are, and he has his own terms that he wants the United States to adhere to. He wants the United States to continue monetary aid. He wants the United States not to wash their hands of South Vietnam and bug out the way that the United States probably wants to. He wants aid to continue. He wants South Vietnam to remain viable. And all that the United States cares about, all that Henry Kissinger is invested in at this moment is, what's on paper when the negotiations end. How does the United States look on paper when these negotiations end? There's a recorded conversation between Nixon and Kissinger where they're discussing the Paris Accords and how things could potentially change if, the Paris Accords as constructed will be accepted, how Nguyen Van Thu might, react to these Paris Accords. Kissinger says to Nixon, quote, "We've got a good deal. The only problem is two. He may well refuse." Nixon responds, quote, "We have to make sure the United States doesn't look like it's selling out a little country." End quote. Then Kissinger responds back to him, "We can't guarantee the outcome in South Vietnam, but we've bought time and we've preserved our integrity." End quote. That Nixon meeting with China in 1972 and the détente that the United States achieved with the Soviet Union around the same time, that was probably the most important part of this entire conflict because it removed some of those fears about what, the communist Soviets would do, what the communist Chinese would do, what the superpower states would do. And it was that fear of the unknown that's been shaping this conflict since 1945. Once that fear of the unknown is removed, it removes a giant piece on the chessboard for both South and North Vietnam, because now as the client states, the puppet states, they have to go about this thing a little bit differently. They've been operating politically, bouncing off of their clients, the Soviets and the Chinese if you're North Vietnam, or the United States if you're South Vietnam. They have been using different methods like blackmail and, subterfuge, these little things behind the curtain in order to achieve politically what they want to achieve. And that changes once the United States and the Soviets and the Chinese stop playing the telephone game. Once they start to get on the same wavelength and understand what the other superpower countries want, that means the clients now can no longer do the blackmail and the backbiting. They have pretty much one or two recourses left, and they start, at least in Nguyen Van Thu's case, he starts operating altogether differently. He has been somebody who has been very compliant. I think it's fair to assume he was a little bit scared that the United States would do to him what the Kennedy administration did to Ziem those many years ago when he was assassinated. To just wanted to stay in power. You see this over and over again where he's elected multiple times in sham elections. He's surrounded by corruption and generals who owe their, places of power to two, but two also owes his place of power to those generals. It's this cohabitation, this, relationship that's symbiotic. To realizes that maybe the writing is on the wall for him staying in power, And so he just refuses to accept the deal that's being made in Paris. And this goes back to the United States. You know, they care about perception. They care about how things are received on the international stage. And if it appears that their client state will not agree to the Paris Agreement, that means that they're abandoning their client state, or you could infer that the United States is abandoning their client state. And so it becomes a situation where the United States has to get a deal done that they like, but also they don't care so much anymore what happens to South Vietnam after the deal is signed, so long as South Vietnam stays intact until the deal is signed, and then whatever happens afterward, it's, well, that's unfortunate. What are you going to do about it? The North Vietnamese realized this just the same that Nguyen Van Thu realized this. And the Chinese leader Zhao Enlai supposedly said to Le Duc Tho, quote, "The most important thing is to let the Americans leave. The situation will change in 6 months or a year," end quote. Meaning, don't expand the war, don't make it any worse. Allow the Americans to get out of Vietnam before you decide to do anything rash. Because the Chinese believed, the North Vietnamese believed, and the South Vietnamese believed that once the Americans left, they would do so for good. And so if you would just prevent a situation arising where the Americans felt like they couldn't leave, you would be all right to do whatever you wanted to do after they left. Nixon continued Operation Linebacker, and in December 1972, North Vietnam sent word through an emissary that they were willing to continue talks in Paris. In a parallel move to make sure that Nguyen Van Thu would cooperate with anything decided in Paris, Nixon sent a memo, or the administration sent a memo, to Saigon threatening to cut off all aid unless Thu agreed to whatever would be decided in Paris. Faced with the potential of no aid whatsoever, or a continued amount of aid after the Paris agreements were agreed to, Nguyen Van Thu agreed to hold off. He would prefer some aid after the Paris agreements to no aid at all. He also supposedly got confirmation that the United States would send military forces back into South Vietnam if the North Vietnamese breached any part of the treaty. This from Max Hastings, quote, "To secure Thu's endorsement, he offered an absolutely contradictory promise of immediate military action if Hanoi breached the terms." Now quoting Kissinger, what Kissinger said to Thu, quote, "It is inconceivable that President Nixon would stand by if North Vietnam attacked again," end quote. Creighton Abrams, who is now the U.S. Army Chief of Staff after being relieved of his duty as General of all forces from Saigon, he told the Vietnamese, quote, "You have to trust me." To which apparently Nguyen Van Thu said, "I have no reason to do so." Even still, Nguyen Van Thu was surprised when the United States pulled out of South Vietnam and essentially just paid them some money to do so. They sent aid, which was slashed in subsequent years, year over year. Senators in Washington couldn't conscience sending hundreds of millions of dollars, even up to $1 billion in aid to a country they'd abandoned. And Nguyen Van Thu in 1972, 73, 74, and 75, he couldn't bring himself to realize that he was being abandoned. He couldn't imagine that it was actually possible after all that we've been through, sort of a thing. The toxic relationship where one partner leaves and the other one is mystified that it could have ended at all, when all the friends are looking at each other going, "We saw this coming a mile away." Henry Kissinger was awarded a Nobel Peace Prize for his role in the Paris Accords. Le Duc Tho was offered one as well, but he refused. You know, par for the course for the Vietnamese communist, the aesthetic. I don't want awards, I'm just doing it for my country. Henry Kissinger becomes an international superstar for his role in these negotiations. And the North Vietnamese, for their part, they sit back and wait and watch. They content themselves from the beginning of 1973 to go back up north or leave their forces where they were in South Vietnam, lick their wounds, and just wait for an opportunity when they could reunite Vietnam under one banner, under Hanoi's banner. That opportunity came when Nixon met his political demise at a hotel called the Watergate, where some of his staffers were seen infiltrating the hotel, and Nixon was overthrown as president, was impeached. And at this moment, with, political struggle and uncertainty in the United States, the North Vietnamese felt it was their time to test and see how far this Vietnamization of Nixon's had really gone. They had seen it at Lam Son 719. They had seen it in the Easter Offensive, and they felt that now, in late 1974, that the time had come for them to once and for all finish this. Van Tien Dung, a NVA commander, People's Army of Vietnam commander, said, quote, "We believed the time had come to test the enemy's real capabilities and to strike with force at the heart of the puppet government," end quote. There's a phenomenon on the ancient battlefield. If you go back and read accounts of Athenian soldiers, Greek hoplites, fighting in battles against the Persians or whoever else, you read accounts and there is this phenomenon that seems to happen where when men run, there's this collective fear that infiltrates the entire army. It's called phobos. The ancients write of it as it's a living, breathing thing. It's a physical thing that infects men on the battlefield. That when one man starts to run, the men standing next to him, oftentimes, at least in the ancient battlefield, these are men that are intimately familiar with the man standing next to him. They're from the same hamlet. They're from the same village. When they see the people standing next to them start to run, they run too. So this phobos infects an army and incapacitates it. You're always trying to, appease phobos on an ancient battlefield. It's where myth and reality kind of blend together and create its own reality. Well, in 1975, you could argue that phobos is very common and present in the South Vietnamese army. Because when the North Vietnamese come down across the DMZ with their tanks, with their infantry, and the United States is no longer there with artillery, with air support, advisors, ground troops, the United States is gone, and the South Vietnamese military is left on their own. And they seem to know we're on our own. And this phobos infects the South Vietnamese military, and when they are hit at Ban Mi Thuot, they begin to run. We should recognize, too, the risk on the North Vietnamese side of this, because we have now got multiple instances of an all-out offensive not working. And we've got another instance of an all-out offensive not really finishing out through the planning stages. A lot of the troops that will take part in this 1975 push, at least on the, NCO, the lower level commissioned officers and non-commissioned officers side, they will have fought in the 1968 and 1972 offensives. And so they have that background going into the 1975 offensive. And you can only imagine the pensiveness, because as they're pushing down, they have their ideas about how the South Vietnamese are going to respond. But the real question is, and this is kind of like the inverse of what the United States has dealt with this entire time, there's the question about, well, what is the U.S. going to do when we invade South Vietnam? Are they going to retaliate? Are they going to send troops back in? Are they going to escalate this conflict further? Because we've now got confirmation that China and the Soviet Union won't lift a finger. What will Kissinger do? From Hanoi's viewpoint, they felt like Henry Kissinger was too preoccupied with the Middle East to lift a finger in South Vietnam. But there were detractors. There were folks thinking that perhaps he had staked his, reputation perhaps on the Paris agreements. That he had become personally invested with all the work he'd done over the previous years in order to, achieve that peace, that if the North Vietnamese broke it, he would become intimately invested in the proceedings. And since everybody, it was like the worst kept secret at the time that Gerald Ford was not calling the shots in Washington with regards to foreign policy. Henry Kissinger was Washington, D.C.'s foreign policy. So if he becomes personally invested the way some of those previous presidents had, perhaps North Vietnam could be in for a world of hurt. They run that risk. Again, and not to mention, this 1975 offensive is a massive undertaking. 500,000 men, 15 divisions. Infantrymen in the People's Army of Vietnam, Bao Ninh, wrote about this gathering of strength that for them was unbelievable, because you got to think of it from the infantryman's perspective. They've been fighting guerrilla struggles for so long. A gathering of force like this has only happened a couple times, and even when it has happened sometimes, there's still elements of guerrilla fighting happening here. This is conventional warfare. Bao Ninh wrote, quote, "Almost all our fighting had been as guerrillas in company strength. We knew that without the Americans, the Southerners were half what they had been." End quote. Initially, things go similarly to how they went in 1972. You get, solid returns for the South Vietnamese at first, and the North Vietnamese aren't yet sure how to use tanks. I mean, there's reports that they are using tanks in night attacks, which they use infantry in night attacks frequently. So let's just throw in some tanks in there too. The problem is, tanks are, you got to be able to see. It's very difficult to steer a tank in the dark. And there's reports that on March 14th, 1975, one tank smashed its gun by running into a tree. Another one ran into a ditch. But this common theme that you see come up over and over and over again, the resilience, the ability for the North Vietnamese military to encounter obstacles and sort of flow around it, like water around a river rock. In Ben My Thuot, they encountered incredible resistance initially, but then 4 tanks broke through, the lines of South Vietnamese soldiers, and once they broke through, the infantry around them were able to dislodge themselves from where they were fighting and push through, and they took over the city in a few hours. Saigon's Chief of Staff, General Cao Van Vien, said of the fall of that city, quote, "This was the most critical juncture of the entire war. Our armed forces now faced a showdown with an adversary who continuously upped the ante." End quote. Again, it's that same thing that we've been seeing consistently throughout this entire conflict, that North Vietnam, and this is incredible, and you almost have to take it out of context for it to be as incredible as it is, because the context is terrifying on a human level. But North Vietnam is able to up the ante consistently. They've been doing this for 30 years. Upping the ante means spending human capital in order to get politically what you want to get done. And if you look at in context what it means for people on the ground, it's terrifying, because it means that strategically you're not protecting human lives by your military attacks. You're throwing tanks in night attacks. You're sending in waves of infantry. And the South Vietnamese are operating in a decidedly Western sort of a way. So it's a bit more conservative, and they're protecting their human lives, their human capital, and the North Vietnamese aren't. And it's this very odd thing that you'll get a few times in history where a country like North Vietnam will start operating in conventional Western warfare sorts of ways, but there's still this strand, right? There's this strand of fatalism or, natural suicidal tendencies where it's like, it doesn't matter how many we lose, as long as we get the job done, sort of a thing. The United States is keeping tabs on how this offensive is going. A CIA report wrote about the fall of Ban My Thuot, quote, "The psychological impact far outweighs the military setback," end quote. This city is a linchpin, and like these previous offensives, there are many places getting attacked all at once. Hue, Da Nang. But Ban My Thuot is like the capital of the Central Highlands, and the Central Highlands are the heart of Vietnam. So when the North Vietnamese troops are able to punch through the South Vietnamese after facing initial pressures, but they're able to deal with it and then punch through, the phobos leaches onto the battlefield, and the South Vietnamese military turns into a fleeing force. Slowly but surely, in installments, they're just fleeing. Arvin General Pham Van Phu wrote that after Ban My Thuot, quote, "It was not a withdrawal, it was a rout," end quote. Arnold Isaacs was a journalist writing about, keeping track of this offensive, wrote, quote, "Tens of thousands died along the roads. It was a military collapse the likes of which no one had predicted," end quote. Of course, it could have been predicted. If you'd have read the tea leaves, right? If you'd have seen how Lam Son 719 had gone, if you'd have seen how the Easter offensive had gone in 1972, you'd have gotten a pretty decent idea that when left to their own devices, without outside help, without air power, it seemed like they couldn't stand on their own. You get this in spurts, right? Things tend to happen, and in the case of Lam Son 719, it's the command structure falls apart a little bit. Now, in the Easter offensive, you repulse the attacks, but a close examination of that offensive reveals that those attacks are repulsed in great part because of the air power that is paired with the infantry on the ground. You remove that, things go a little bit differently. And two, there's this panic seeping through the military all at once. A lieutenant general wrote that, quote, "Da Nang died not from enemy attack, but from panic," end quote. And you feel for the soldiers too, because they're faced with a terrible conundrum. South Vietnamese soldiers, they have their duty to their country and their government, which, let's be honest, not many of them are fully bought into their government. They've also got their families. And in a situation like this, where there's a massive withdrawal and the communist forces are seeping down through Pleiku and the Central Highlands, South Vietnamese forces at the man level, at the individual boots on the ground level, their attention leaves the military and goes to their families. They're thinking, how can I get my family to safety? Because after Pleiku falls, after the Central Highlands falls, it's like a string of dominoes. Everybody kind of knows that once that fell, you were going to have a complete collapse. It was going to be slow, but you were going to have a collapse. And when the United States didn't send any planes to reinforce that narrative that, the South Vietnamese have the air, everybody can kind of read the writing on the wall, and South Vietnamese troops start deserting by their hundreds, going to try and protect their families. This retreat from Pleiku as one source called it, ignominious. Fathers, mothers, stumbling along the roads. Hundreds of thousands of people are leaving Pleiku all at once, walking along the roads, children struggling along behind them. South Vietnamese troops are deserting in their hundreds to go and protect their families. It's a collapse from the top down of the South Vietnamese military. April 1975 is a month of evacuations. The South Vietnamese are calling in every favor they've got with American connections that they might have. If they were a porter for an American or were, somebody who worked in any capacity for an American, you're calling them up. You're saying, hey, can you get me on a flight anywhere? I'll go to Europe. I'll go to the United States. I'll go to Singapore. Any string they could pull, they're pulling it. You've also got this very odd moment where South Vietnamese, famous South Vietnamese abroad film stars feel this obligation to return home because everybody can kind of read the writing on the wall that Saigon is about to not be Saigon anymore. There's a story about a South Vietnamese major, Nguyen Quang Duan, who returns to South Vietnam after completing a course at Fort Benning, and he arrives in the airport and the girl checking them in looks at him and his companions completely bewildered. Like, what are you doing? She says, quote, why'd you come back? The lot fell last night, end quote. Maybe a common theme of the evacuation of Saigon is the many, many innocents who just get caught in the crossfire, in the meat grinder of this slow-moving invasion. All these South Vietnamese are calling in every favor they've got with the CIA, with anybody they've been associated with. And Max Hastings writes about how the CIA are getting all these calls from Vietnamese and ignoring them. He writes, quote, on that final day of the evacuation, shamefaced CIA staff listened to the bleats and whistles of unanswered radios in the operations room. Static crackling pleas for help on every channel coming from all over Vietnam. Now quoting one of them, I'm Mr. Han, the translator, end quote. Frank Snepp called these calls sound mares. It was never plausible that the Americans could conduct an ordered extraction of all those Vietnamese linked to the U.S., even if the ambassador had displayed greater foresight. Instead, vast numbers of panic-stricken people embarked on escapes in ships and small craft of every shape and size, which dotted the seas off South Vietnam during the weeks that followed. A few fortunate folk flew away, end quote. Some South Vietnamese soldiers, seeing the writing on the wall, donned red armbands so that they would match the North Vietnamese troops and surrendered themselves to the NVA troops as they entered Saigon. Lieutenant Nguyen Quoc Si writes about surrendering to the North Vietnamese. He writes, quote, many were maybe 13, 14, 15. We said to each other, how could we have lost the war to boys like this? Surely we should have been able to beat these people. We were very, very sad. The communists had no idea what to do with us. I handed my Colt 45 to a boy who started playing with it like a toy. I had to take it back and remove the bullets before he shot himself. End quote. President Tu is a bit of a sympathetic figure in this business because he never fully understood or never imagined, perhaps, that the Americans would actually do what they said they were going to do and abandon him. He always thought that they would come in at the last minute, sort of clean things up, send in some B-52 bombers, and just keep it going even further. He couldn't imagine that it would actually end after so many years of struggle. He was numb at the end. And there's no written down anecdotes to describe Tu in the final moments before he's evacuated and he goes to California. But there's a moment where an American ambassador is waving goodbye to him and he just says goodbye, and he describes Tu as being almost like a wax doll, just devoid. And it's not to say that Tu is a sympathetic character overall, but I can only imagine the moment when you realize everything is futile and you've lost and your country is destroyed. And I can't even imagine the different emotions that come with that, in line with his corrupt reputation. There was a rumor that persisted afterwards that Tu made off with gold reserves in his suitcase, and he took them with him to California, although there's really no evidence that he and his wife lived in any sort of luxury in California, and that he died in relative obscurity and poverty. Max Hastings writes that, quote, Tu's epitaph must be that he became a collapsed puppet when the Americans chose to drop the strings, end quote. You can find pictures of the fall of Saigon, and it's these excited, victorious North Vietnamese soldiers, and they're riding into Saigon on their tanks, and they're almost bewildered. At least, if you can imagine that. I'm reading into it maybe, but they're bewildered because they are accomplishing this goal that they've had for decades, right? And it's almost like they don't know what to do with it. They're so excited, and they don't know what it means. They don't know all the implications, but they've won. They've overthrown the puppet government, all these things that they've been told about the South Vietnamese. They've won, and yet there's this like almost 1,000-yard stare involved in some of these photos as well. Bao Ninh writes about this in his autobiographical novel, The Sorrow of War. He writes, quote, After 1975, all that had quieted. The wind of war had stopped. The branches of conflict had stopped rustling. As we had won, then that meant justice had won. That had been some consolation, or had it? Think carefully. Look at your own existence. Look carefully now at the peace we have, painful, bitter, and sad. And look at who won the war. End quote. If you try and make this a binary sort of a thing, the North Vietnamese won. They achieved their independence from, the colonial overlords. But at what cost? Does Vietnam win the Vietnam War? Or does one part of Vietnam win the Vietnam War? In an ideological struggle for, free government, I say free with heavy emphasis of air quotes there, but in a struggle between the potential of a free government and a government that controls every aspect of people's lives, the Hanoi Politburo wins. A lot of civilians are thrown into re-education camps at the end of the war after the fall of Saigon. And you have thousands of people that cram together in tiny little boats just to try and escape to safety because they can no longer find a plane, or all the planes have left. There's images of helicopters leaving Saigon, and people are hanging off the skids and then falling into the streets below. Tran Ngoc Chau, who was a South Vietnamese National Assembly member, he was put in a re-education camp near Long Tan, and he had to rewrite his biography multiple times, each time putting more emphasis on the crimes that he had committed against the Hanoi Politburo. These sessions are marathon sessions. They would go all night long, from morning to evening, or from sunset to sunrise. Very few breaks. These sorts of re-education sessions are designed to break down these people's individual identity. And there were probably 200 or 300,000 people besides Chau that had to experience this same sort of a thing. And then there's also the redistribution of wealth, of land. And of course, if you were loyal to the Hanoi Politburo, if you were a member of the NVA regular troops, you're more likely than not to get, a kickback from all this. It's the classic, to the winner go the spoils. Truckloads of medical equipment were taken out of South Vietnamese hospitals and shipped north. The South Vietnamese have more of these materials than what North Vietnam would have had. There's a story where a Hanoi doctor goes into a hospital in Saigon and he says, "Oh, you have too much. We can cure lots of diseases without all of these things." And so then he orders a lot of the medical equipment to be sent north. Additionally, the policymakers in Vietnam were in for an unwelcome surprise when they realized that now that they had won the war, they were no longer the prized puppet for Soviet Russia and China. What need did Soviet Russia and China have to send aid anymore because the Vietnamese had already won? They were no longer in a struggle with the United States. There was no more to be gained by the superpower governments to continue sending aid to Vietnam, and so aid dwindled. Max Hastings writes about it, quote, "The war's ending inflicted an unwelcome shock upon Vietnam's leaders. The superpowers of both East and West relegated their country, which for 2 decades had sustained a prominence far beyond that confirmed by its size or strength, to the margin of affairs. China became increasingly adversarial. By the late 1970s, Beijing officials referred contemptuously to one Hanoi Politburo member as the beggar because of the frequency with which he appealed for aid. In 1979, China and Vietnam waged a brief but bloody frontier war. Russian aid dwindled dramatically, and with the collapse of the Soviet Union disappeared altogether. By 1980, resource-rich Vietnam had become one of the poorest nations on earth." End quote. That sense of collectivism, of, party fervor, of nationalism tended to dwindle when the people were suffering. Le Duc Tho wrote a poem in 1990 where he, laments the lack of collectivism, the lack of shared vision that has now faded since they've won the war. The war's over, right? He writes, quote, "In the past, we had strong emotion, sharing life and death, sharing a bowl of rice and a shirt. But now people take money, and individuality is a measure for emotion and feelings. The sense of camaraderie has faded." End quote. Bao Ninh would write about the after effects of the war and kind of the fugue that comes after a conflict like this, where you're trying to figure out, what did it all mean? What was our part in something like this? Did we accomplish something worthwhile? You're doing that self-audit where you're trying to figure out if, the actions you took, if they were worth it, if you got something worthwhile in the end. Bao Ninh writes, quote, "The war was a real war, and in that war we were real people. But the meaning of it all, we don't know. We still don't know." End quote. For the Americans, it's the same. It's a psychological experience as well. Politically, you have one sort of a feeling about it, but also there's even more of a personal thing too. Henry Kissinger kind of represents the political feeling where he says that we fought a military war and our opponents fought a political war. But even that doesn't tell the full truth, because the Americans fought a political war as well. It just changed. It was a political war to beat the superpowers in China and Soviet Union. But then once the United States realizes that the Soviet Union and China are not going to intercede on behalf of Vietnam because proxy wars have become the method of the day, you're sort of left with this a massive mistake that you realize you've made, but you can't undo, and so the only way is through. Kissinger continues that quote by saying, "We sought the enemy's breaking point, and they did not have one. That collectivism, that national fervor, the revolution. U.S. soldiers return home to a country that despises them because by the end of the war, policymakers in Washington are shouting that we're the bad guys. We have become the thing that we can never countenance. The United States got in this war as like the policeman. We were going to go over to Southeast Asia and we were going to police the Asian bloc. We were going to prevent them from falling into communism. We were going to prevent them from joining, the dark side, the Sith. And then inevitably, communism wins. And yet, that same domino theory that everybody was terrified of doesn't come true, because each country has their own ideas about what they want for their future. General Giap says that they fought not for Marxism, but for liberty. Something that Americans can relate to. Vietnam was a collective experience all the way around. for the Vietnamese, for the Americans, for regular people, for politics, for everything. It consumed multiple presidents, might have overthrown a couple. Michael Herr has this quote where he's trying to process the Vietnam War, and I think it's one of my favorites about the war because it kind of says so much without saying much at all. Michael Herr writes, quote, "Vietnam, Vietnam, Vietnam. We've all been there." This series is very special to me, and your support, you listening to this series, has meant a lot to me. I was working on this series when my first son was born, and I think there's always going to be some part of me that's especially fond of this because I can go back to, Hell in a Small Place 2, 1, 3, and I can trace the growth of my first son through this series and the things that I was working on, and there's always going to be a special part in it for me. I think this is a series, too, that really tested my mettle, just at least for me, trying to see if I could do this, if I could do it the way I wanted to do it, if I could tell a very, very long story in what I felt to be the right way. This is a special series to me, and I'm so thankful that you have joined me on it. I'm very excited to get into some other subjects. I'm very excited to depart, the 1960s and 70s and try something altogether different. But I think you'll find that as these shows continue, they might not be all that different. There might be similar themes, similar stories. I think the heart of these shows will probably always be the same. I think you'll always know what's a compendium show and what's not. I'm so thankful that you have joined me as I've been discovering this as, the process is going on. Again, I could not dream of doing this without your support. To all of those who support the show on Patreon, who subscribe to the Substack, thank you so much. Anybody who's sent a kind word on social media, I greatly appreciate it. If you'd like to stay abreast of anything happening in the future as I develop future compendium shows, feel free to click the link in the show notes below to join the Substack newsletter where I release newsletters weekly. And if you feel like supporting the show a bit more than listening or rating, reviewing, if you want to go that extra mile, you can support the show on Patreon. There'll be a link to that in the show notes as well. Thank you all so much for your support. I'll see you again very soon.